Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep, where we explore the mysteries and enigmas that have captivated investigators and armchair detectives for generations. I'm curious tonight, where are you listening from, and what time is it in your corner of the world? Whether you're settling in as the evening shadows grow long, or perhaps it's the deep hours of the night where you are, you've found your way to the perfect place for those who find comfort in the methodical unraveling of life's most perplexing puzzles. Tonight, we'll journey together through several cases that have left their mark on criminal history, each one a thread in the complex tapestry of human nature and the pursuit of justice. These are stories told with respect for those whose lives were forever changed, and with the gentle cadence that makes them suitable companions for your evening rest. So find your most comfortable position, perhaps adjust your pillow just so, and let your breathing settle into its natural rhythm as we begin our first story. In the winter of 1910, New York City hummed with the energy of a metropolis coming into its own. The streets were lined with gas lamps that cast dancing shadows on the sidewalks, and the air carried the mingled sense of coal smoke, horse-drawn carriages, and the promise of modernity just around the corner. It was in this setting that Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold, a young woman of 25, stepped out of her family's elegant townhouse on East 79th Street on the morning of December 12th. Never to return. Dorothy was what society would have called a refined young lady, the daughter of Francis R. Arnold, a successful importer of perfumes. She had been educated at Bryn Mawr College, one of the most prestigious institutions for women of her time. Her life moved in the comfortable circles of Manhattan's upper class, where afternoon teas and evening soirees marked the rhythm of days, and where a young woman's reputation was as carefully tended as a delicate garden. On that particular December morning, the city was gripped by an early winter chill. Dorothy had plans that seemed perfectly ordinary for a woman of her station. She intended to visit her friend Gladys King, and perhaps do some shopping along Fifth Avenue, where the department stores were beginning to display their holiday finery. In windows that drew crowds of admirers, she was wearing a dark blue serge suit, tailored in the fashion of the day, with a black velvet hat adorned with a blue bow. Her coat was of black caracal, luxurious and warm against the December air. In her purse, she carried $25, a substantial sum for the time. Enough for several days of comfortable living for most New Yorkers. The morning unfolded as Dorothy had planned. She met with Gladys King, and together they spent time discussing the sorts of things that occupied young women of their social standing. Literature, perhaps, or the latest fashions, or the social events that would mark the approaching holiday season. After their visit, Dorothy made her way to Brentano's bookstore, a popular destination for the literary-minded residents of the city. At Brentano's, she made a purchase that would later become a crucial detail in the investigation that followed. She bought a book of short stories, paying for it with crisp bills from her purse. The clerk who served her would later remember the transaction clearly, partly because Dorothy was a regular customer, and partly because she had engaged in pleasant conversation about the book she was purchasing. After leaving Brentano's, Dorothy's next stop was Park and Tilford's, an upscale confectionery and gourmet shop. There, she bought a pound of chocolates, perhaps as a gift, or maybe simply to satisfy her own sweet tooth. The purchase was routine, unremarkable, the kind of transaction that happened hundreds of times each day in the busy shops along Fifth Avenue. It was as Dorothy left Park and Tilford's around 2 o'clock in the afternoon that she encountered George Griscom Jr., a man who had been courting her attention for some time. Griscom was 40 years old, 15 years Dorothy's senior, and while he came from a respectable family, he lacked the financial prospects that Dorothy's parents deemed suitable for their daughter. The relationship had been a source of tension in the Arnold household, with Dorothy's parents expressing their disapproval in the firm but polite terms that characterized upper-class family disputes of the era. The meeting between Dorothy and Griscom appeared casual to outside observers. They spoke briefly on the sidewalk, their conversation lost to the noise of passing carriages and the general bustle of the busy street. To those who noticed them, they seemed like any other couple engaged in the kind of polite social interaction that was common among their set. After a few minutes, they parted ways, Griscom heading in one direction, Dorothy in another, and then Dorothy Arnold vanished, as completely as if she had been absorbed into the very fabric of the city itself. When Dorothy failed to return home for dinner that evening, her family initially felt only mild concern. It was not entirely unusual for a young woman of her independence to extend her afternoon activities, particularly during the busy social season. But as the evening wore on and no word came from Dorothy, that mild concern began to transform into something deeper and more troubling. By the following morning, when Dorothy's bed remained unslept in and there was still no sign of her, the Arnold family knew that something was terribly wrong. Francis Arnold, a man accustomed to solving problems through methodical action and the application of resources, immediately began his own investigation. He was reluctant to involve the police, partly due to the social stigma that surrounded public scandal in families of their standing, and partly out of hope that Dorothy would return on her own, perhaps having impulsively decided to extend her shopping trip or visit with friends. The family's private investigation began with methodical inquiries to Dorothy's known associates. Friends were contacted discreetly, their conversations carefully steered toward whether they had seen or heard from Dorothy. Hotel registers were examined, and transportation companies were quietly approached to determine if Dorothy had purchased tickets for travel out of the city. As days passed without any trace of Dorothy, the scope of the search widened. Private detectives were engaged, men experienced in the delicate art of investigation that wouldn't attract unwanted attention or generate the kind of newspaper coverage that could damage a family's reputation. These investigators canvassed the hospitals and morgues of New York City, a grim but necessary task that yielded no results. The breakthrough in the case, if it could be called that, came when the investigation focused on George Griscom Jr. When questioned about his encounter with Dorothy on December 12th, Griscom's responses seemed evasive and contradictory. He claimed that their meeting had been brief and casual, that they had discussed nothing of importance, and that Dorothy had seemed perfectly normal when they parted. But there were inconsistencies in his account, small details that didn't align with what other witnesses remembered about the encounter. As the investigation continued, more troubling information about Griscom began to emerge. It became apparent that he had been leading a double life of sorts, presenting himself to the Arnold family as a respectable suitor, while maintaining relationships and activities that would have been considered scandalous by the standards of their social circle. There were suggestions of gambling debts, of associations with individuals of questionable character, of a lifestyle that was far removed from the moral rectitude expected of a man seeking to marry into a family like the Arnolds. But perhaps most significantly, it was discovered that Griscom had left New York City shortly after Dorothy's disappearance, traveling to Italy under circumstances that seemed suspiciously convenient. When contacted by investigators in Europe, his explanations for his sudden departure were vague and unsatisfying. He claimed that his trip had been planned for some time, but there was little evidence to support this assertion. The investigation into Dorothy's disappearance would eventually involve the New York Police Department, despite the Arnold family's initial reluctance to seek official help. Detectives combed through every aspect of Dorothy's life, searching for clues that might explain her vanishing. They interviewed her friends, her family, the shopkeepers who had served her on her final day, and anyone else who might have had contact with her. One theory that gained considerable attention was that Dorothy had committed suicide, perhaps by throwing herself into the East River. The pressures of her family's disapproval of her relationship with Griscom, combined with the restrictive social expectations placed upon women of her class, might have created a sense of hopelessness that led to such a desperate act. Detectives dragged portions of the river, but no body was ever recovered. Another theory suggested that Dorothy had been the victim of foul play, possibly at the hands of Griscom himself. This theory was supported by the inconsistencies in Griscom's account of their final meeting, his suspicious behavior following Dorothy's disappearance, and his hurried departure from the country. However, despite extensive investigation, no evidence could be found to definitively link him to any harm that might have befallen Dorothy. A third possibility, and one that captured the imagination of the public when news of the disappearance finally became widespread, was that Dorothy had voluntarily disappeared to escape the constraints of her privileged but restrictive life. Perhaps she had grown tired of the expectations placed upon her, the pressure to marry appropriately, the limitations imposed by her social position. This theory suggested that Dorothy had used her intelligence and resources to create a new identity for herself, possibly in another city or even another country. The case of Dorothy Arnold's disappearance became one of the most celebrated missing person cases of the early 20th century. Newspapers across the country picked up the story, fascinated by the mystery of a wealthy young woman who had simply vanished from one of the busiest streets in New York City. The case had all the elements that captured public imagination: wealth, mystery, romance, and the tantalizing possibility that someone could simply choose to disappear from their old life and start anew. Years passed with no resolution to the mystery. The Arnold family continued their search, following up on every reported sighting, every tip, every suggestion of where Dorothy might be found. Private detectives were kept on retainer for years, their investigations taking them across the United States and into Europe. But despite all these efforts, no trace of Dorothy Arnold was ever definitively found. George Griscom, Jr. remained a person of interest in the case for the rest of his life. He eventually returned to the United States, but his reputation had been permanently damaged by his association with the disappearance. He was never formally charged with any crime related to Dorothy's vanishing, but the cloud of suspicion that surrounded him never fully lifted. He died in 1928, taking whatever knowledge he might have had about Dorothy's fate to his grave. The Arnold family never gave up hope of finding Dorothy, but as the years turned into decades, the active search gradually diminished. Francis Arnold died in 1922, still not knowing what had become of his daughter. Dorothy's mother continued to believe that her daughter might still be alive somewhere, living under another name, but she too passed away without ever learning the truth. The case officially remains unsolved to this day, more than a century after Dorothy Arnold walked out of her family's townhouse on that December morning. Over the years, there have been numerous claimed sightings, alleged confessions, and theories about what might have happened to her. Some investigators have suggested that she was murdered and her body hidden so effectively that it has never been found. Others maintain that she successfully created a new life for herself and lived out her years in anonymity, perhaps always looking over her shoulder, but free from the constraints that had defined her existence in New York society. In the end, the disappearance of Dorothy Arnold remains one of those mysteries that seems to capture something essential about the human condition. It speaks to our desire for freedom, our fear of the unknown, and our fascination with the idea that someone can simply step out of their life and vanish without a trace. The case has inspired numerous books, articles, and theories, but the truth of what happened to Dorothy Arnold on that winter day in 1910 remains as elusive as ever. As we consider Dorothy's story in the quiet of this evening, we might reflect on how the mystery has endured precisely because it offers no easy answers. The human mind seeks resolution, closure, understanding, but some stories resist our attempts to categorize and explain them. They remain open questions, invitations to wonder, puzzles that continue to intrigue us long after the principals have passed from the scene. The gaslight that once illuminated the streets of Dorothy's New York has long since been replaced by Electric bulbs, which in turn have given way to LED lights that cast their own modern shadows on the sidewalks. But the essential mystery remains unchanged, as compelling today as it was when the first newspaper headlines announced that a young woman had vanished from Fifth Avenue without explanation. Asterisk, perhaps that's the true legacy of Dorothy Arnold's story, not the solution to the mystery, but the mystery itself and what it tells us about the complexity of human nature, the unpredictability of life, and the enduring power of the unknown to capture our imagination and hold it fast. The year 1929 was drawing to a close when the residents of New York City's Lower East Side were confronted with a mystery that would challenge the very foundations of logical deduction. It was a puzzle that seemed to mock the basic laws of physics and human possibility, a crime that appeared to have been committed by someone who could walk through walls and vanish into thin air. Isidor Fink was a man who lived quietly in the shadows of the great city, a Polish immigrant who had arrived in America seeking the opportunities that drew millions to its shores. He had settled into the rhythms of working-class life in Manhattan. His world was small but sufficient, a modest apartment that also served as his place of business, where he sold newspapers, cigarettes, and small sundries to the neighborhood residents who appreciated having such conveniences close at hand. The apartment was located on the 5th floor of a tenement building on East 4th Street, in a neighborhood where the sounds of multiple languages mixed together in the hallways and the sense of various ethnic cuisines drifted through the thin walls. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors by sight, if not by name, where the rhythms of daily life were punctuated by the sounds of children playing in the courtyard and the calls of vendors hawking their wares on the street. Below, Fink's apartment consisted of just 2 rooms. The front room served as his shop, with a small display of newspapers arranged near the window and shelves holding cigarettes, candy, and other small items that his neighbors might need. Back room was his private quarters, simply furnished with a bed, a dresser, and the basic necessities of solitary living. The arrangement allowed him to conduct his modest business while maintaining his privacy, a setup that suited a man who seemed to prefer the quiet company of his books and newspapers to the social whirl of the city around him. On the evening of March 9, 1929, the usual sounds of the tenement building settled into the quiet rhythms of nighttime. Children had been called in from their play, families had gathered for their evening meals, and the working men and women of the neighborhood had returned home to rest after their long days of labor. It was during this peaceful interlude that the tranquility was shattered by a sound that would echo through the annals of criminal history. Mrs. Smith, who lived in the apartment directly below Fink's, was settling in for the evening when she heard what sounded like a struggle coming from above. There were heavy footsteps, the sound of furniture being moved or knocked over, and what might have been voices raised in anger or alarm. The sounds were brief but intense, lasting only a few minutes before giving way to an ominous silence that seemed even more troubling than the commotion that had preceded it. Concerned about her neighbor, Mrs. Smith made her way upstairs and knocked on Fink's door. When there was no response, she called out his name, but again received no answer. The silence that greeted her attempts to rouse Fink was complete and somehow menacing, as if the very air around the apartment had absorbed something dark and final. Growing increasingly worried, Mrs. Smith enlisted the help of other neighbors, and together they tried to determine what might have happened in the apartment above. They called out repeatedly, knocked loudly on the door, and even tried to peer through the keyhole, but all their efforts yielded no response from within. The apartment seemed to have become a sealed vault, giving up no secrets about what might have transpired behind its locked door. Eventually, the concern of the neighbors reached the point where they felt justified in contacting the police. When the officers arrived, they too found themselves confronted with the puzzle of the locked apartment. The door to Fink's rooms was secured from the inside, with both the regular lock engaged and the chain latch fastened. The windows of the apartment, 5 stories above the street, were similarly secured from within, and there was no fire escape or other means by which someone could have entered or exited the rooms from the outside. The police officers, experienced in the various ways that criminals might attempt to conceal their actions, conducted a thorough examination of the apartment's exterior. They checked the walls of the building for any signs that someone might have climbed up or down, examined the neighboring apartments for evidence that someone might have accessed Fink's rooms through an adjoining wall, and even investigated the possibility that the building's dumbwaiter or other service access might have been used. All of these investigations yielded negative results. Asterisk. With no apparent way to gain entry to the apartment through normal means, the police made the decision to break down the door. The solid wood gave way reluctantly, the sound of splintering timber echoing through the hallway as the officers forced their way into the rooms that had been sealed for hours. What they found inside defied explanation and would become the central puzzle of one of New York's most baffling unsolved crimes. Isitor Fink lay dead on the floor of his front room, his body positioned in a way that suggested he had fallen where he stood. There was clear evidence of violence. Fink had been shot 3 times, with wounds to his chest and abdomen that would have been immediately fatal. But the physical evidence of the crime was far less puzzling than the circumstances surrounding it. The apartment was completely sealed from the inside. Every window was latched shut, the door had been locked and chained from within, and there was no sign that any of the room's barriers had been tampered with or compromised. The killer, whoever they might have been, appeared to have committed the crime and then vanished without leaving any trace of how they had entered or exited the scene. The investigation that followed was exhaustive and frustrating in equal measure. Detectives scoured the apartment for any clue that might explain how the killer had managed to commit the crime and escape from what appeared to be a completely sealed room. They examined every inch of the walls, floors, and ceiling, searching for hidden passages, concealed doors, or any other architectural feature that might have provided access to the apartment. The building itself was subjected to intense scrutiny. Investigators mapped every room, every closet, every service access, looking for any connection between Fink's apartment and the rest of the building that might have been overlooked. They interviewed the building's superintendent, its former tenants, and anyone else who might have knowledge of its construction or layout. The investigation extended to the building's blueprints and construction records, in the hope that some forgotten detail might provide the key to understanding how the impossible crime had been committed. The search for a motive proved equally challenging. Fink appeared to have been a man without enemies, someone who lived quietly and peacefully in his small corner of the world. His business was modest and straightforward, unlikely to generate the kind of conflicts that might lead to violence. He had no known debts, no gambling problems, no romantic entanglements that might have created dangerous jealousies. His life seemed to be characterized by routine and solitude, making it difficult to identify anyone who might have had reason to wish him harm. The investigation into Fink's personal relationships revealed a man who kept largely to himself. He had acquaintances among his neighbors and customers, but no close friends who might have insight into any troubles he might have been facing. His family connections were limited, with most of his relatives still in Poland, and his communications with the old country were infrequent and apparently unremarkable. Financial motives also seemed unlikely. Fink's business generated only enough income to support his simple lifestyle, and there was no evidence that he had accumulated any significant wealth that might have attracted criminal attention. The modest cash that was kept in the apartment for making change in his business transactions was still present when his body was discovered, eliminating robbery as a clear motive for the crime. As the weeks passed without any breakthrough in the case, theories began to emerge that grew increasingly speculative and fantastic. Some investigators wondered if Fink might have been killed by someone with expertise in magic or escape artistry, someone who possessed knowledge of techniques that could make the impossible seem routine. This theory suggested that the killer might have been familiar with the methods used by stage magicians to create the illusion of appearing and disappearing in sealed containers. Others proposed that the crime might have been committed by someone with specialized knowledge of the building's construction, perhaps someone who had been involved in its original construction or subsequent renovations, and who knew of architectural features that were not apparent to casual observation. This theory required the existence of hidden passages or concealed access points that had somehow escaped the detection of the thorough police investigation. A more exotic theory suggested that the crime might have been committed using some form of weapon that could be fired from outside the apartment, perhaps through a small opening that could subsequently be sealed to conceal the point of entry. Investigators examined this possibility by testing various scenarios involving projectiles that might be fired through keyholes, cracks in walls, or other tiny apertures. However, the nature of Fink's wounds and the ballistics evidence made this explanation seem highly improbable. The case attracted considerable attention from both the press and the public, who were fascinated by the apparently impossible nature of the crime. Newspaper articles described it as a real-life locked room mystery, comparing it to the puzzles that were popular in detective fiction of the era. Amateur sleuths and professional investigators alike proposed solutions ranging from the plausible to the wildly speculative. Asterisk. One persistent theory involved the possibility that Fink had been killed by someone he knew and trusted, someone who had been admitted to the apartment voluntarily. According to this theory, the killer had somehow managed to secure the apartment from the inside after committing the crime, and had then escaped through some means that was not apparent to investigators. However, this theory still required explaining how the killer had managed to leave the sealed apartment, a problem that remained as intractable as ever. The investigation continued for months, with detectives following up on every lead, every tip, every suggestion that might provide insight into the case. They interviewed hundreds of people who had any connection to Fink or to the neighborhood where he lived. They consulted with experts in ballistics, architecture, magic, and any other field that might offer relevant expertise. They recreated the crime scene repeatedly, testing various theories about how the killer might have entered and exited the apartment. Despite all these efforts, the case gradually faded from active investigation as more pressing crimes demanded police attention and resources. Isidore Fink's murder joined the ranks of unsolved cases, filed away in police archives, but never officially closed. The mystery of how a man could be murdered in a completely sealed room, with no apparent means of entry or exit for his killer, remained as baffling as ever. Years passed, and occasional renewed interest in the case would surface when new investigators decided to take a fresh look at the evidence. Each new examination brought the hope that modern techniques or a different perspective might finally unlock the secret of the impossible crime. But the passage of time seemed only to deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. The case of Isidore Fink represents one of those rare crimes that seem to challenge our basic understanding of what is possible in the physical world. It stands as a reminder that despite all our scientific knowledge and investigative techniques, there are still mysteries that resist explanation, puzzles that continue to confound us decades after they first captured our attention. Asterisk. In the quiet hours of the night, when the city settles into rest and the sounds of daily life give way to contemplative silence, the story of Isidore Fink invites us to consider the boundaries between the possible and the impossible, the known and the unknowable. It reminds us that even in our modern world, surrounded by technology and scientific understanding, there remain corners of human experience that continue to elude our comprehension. The locked room on East 4th Street has long since been rented to new tenants, and the building has witnessed the passage of generations of residents who likely know nothing of the mystery that once unfolded within its walls. But the puzzle remains, waiting patiently for someone with the insight or the knowledge to finally provide the answer that has eluded investigators for nearly a century. Perhaps the true fascination of the Isidore Fink case lies not in its eventual solution, but in its ability to remind us that mystery and wonder can still exist in our increasingly explained and cataloged world. It stands as a testament to the complexity of human nature and the unpredictability of life, a reminder that sometimes the most compelling stories are those that refuse to provide us with the closure we seek. As we reflect on this puzzling case in the peaceful quiet of our evening, we might find comfort in the knowledge that some mysteries are valuable precisely because they remain mysterious, inviting us to wonder, to speculate, and to acknowledge the limits of our understanding while appreciating the enduring power of the unknown to capture our imagination and hold it fast. Asterisk, the desert wind carries many secrets across the vast expanses of Mexico, and among them is the mystery of a man whose words had already made him immortal, but whose fate would become one of literature's most enduring enigmas. Ambrose Bierce, master of the sardonic tale and chronicler of human folly, walked into the chaos of revolutionary Mexico in 1913 and was never seen again, leaving behind only questions that have echoed through more than a century of speculation and search. To understand the mystery of Bierce's disappearance, we must first understand the man himself, for his character and his choices led him inexorably toward that fateful journey into the unknown. Born in Ohio in 1842, Bierce had come of age during the American Civil War, an experience that would shape both his worldview and his writing for the rest of his life. He had enlisted as a young man, full of the idealistic fervor that marked his generation's response to the great conflict of their time. But the war that Bierce experienced was far removed from the romantic notions of glory and honor that had initially inspired his service. He witnessed firsthand the brutal realities of combat, the senseless waste of human life, the way that grand causes could be reduced to mud and blood, and the screams of the wounded. At the Battle of Shiloh, at Chickamauga, at dozens of other engagements whose names were written in the blood of young Americans, Bierce saw the face of human nature stripped of its pretenses and illusions. These experiences left him with a profound cynicism about human nature and human institutions, a darkness of vision that would permeate his later writing and make him one of America's most distinctive literary voices. His short stories, collected in volumes like Tales of Soldiers and Civilians and Can Such Things Be?, were marked by a mordant humor and a fascination with death, fate, and the ironic twists that seem to govern human existence. Perhaps his most famous story, an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, demonstrated his mastery of psychological realism and his ability to explore the strange workings of the human mind under extreme stress. The tale of Peyton Farquhar's final moments as he faces execution during the Civil War became a classic of American literature, studied in schools and adapted for television, its twist ending as shocking to modern readers as it was to Bierce's contemporaries. But Bierce was more than just a writer of fiction. He was also a journalist, a critic, and a social commentator whose sharp pen made him both famous and notorious. His column in the San Francisco Examiner, where he worked for many years, was a forum for his observations on politics, literature, and the various follies of his fellow human beings. He was known for his devastating reviews of books and authors he deemed inferior, and his wit was sharp enough to make enemies as well as admirers. His personal life was marked by tragedy and disappointment. His marriage to Mary Ellen Day had produced 3 children, but the union was troubled from the beginning. Bierce was not an easy man to live with. His cynicism and his drinking created strains that eventually became unbearable. The marriage ended in separation, though not divorce, and Bierce found himself increasingly isolated from the conventional domestic life that might have provided stability and comfort. The deaths of his 2 sons, Day and Lee, were devastating blows that seemed to confirm his dark view of existence. Day died in a shooting incident that may have been suicide, while Lee succumbed to pneumonia. These losses deepened Bierce's sense of the fundamental cruelty and meaninglessness of life, reinforcing the themes that had always marked his writing. By 1913, Bierce was 71 years old, an age when most men of his era would have been content to settle into quiet retirement. But Bierce was not most men, and the idea of a peaceful decline into old age held no appeal for him. He had grown tired of his life in California, tired of the literary world that he felt had passed him by, tired of the pretenses and compromises that seemed to define civilized existence. It was in this frame of mind that Bierce became fascinated by the revolution that was then tearing Mexico apart. The country was in the throes of a violent struggle between various factions, each claiming to represent the true interests of the Mexican people. Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, Venustiano Carranza, and others were leading armies across the Mexican landscape, their causes as complex and contradictory as the country they were fighting to control. To Bierce, this chaos represented something authentic and vital, a return to the kind of fundamental human struggle that he had witnessed during the Civil War. Here was a place where the pretenses of civilization had been stripped away, where men fought and died for causes they believed in, where life was reduced to its essential elements of survival, loyalty, and violence. In October 1913, Bierce began making preparations for what he described as a journey to Mexico. He wrote letters to friends indicating that he intended to observe the revolution firsthand, perhaps to write about it, perhaps simply to experience once again the kind of raw human drama that had shaped his understanding of life. Some of his correspondence suggested that he was planning to join the army of Pancho Villa, though whether as a combatant, an observer, or something in between was never entirely clear. The letters that Bierce wrote during this period have become famous for their cryptic and ominous tone. To one friend he wrote, "Goodbye. If you hear of my being stood up against a Mexican stone wall and shot to rags, please know that I think that a pretty good way to depart this life. It beats old age, disease, or falling down the cellar stairs. To be a gringo in Mexico, that is euthanasia." These words have been analyzed and debated by scholars and amateur sleuths for decades. Did they represent a genuine death wish? A desire to end his life in a dramatic and meaningful way, rather than face the indignities of old age? Or were they simply the kind of dark humor that had always characterized Bierce's view of existence? An ironic commentary on the risks he was undertaking, rather than a genuine expression of suicidal intent. In December 1913, Bierce crossed the border into Mexico at El Paso, Texas. He was carrying letters of introduction to various revolutionary leaders, and his intention was apparently to make his way to wherever the action was most intense. The last confirmed sighting of him was in the city of Chihuahua, where he was seen in the company of Pancho Villa's forces. After that, Ambrose Bierce vanished as completely as if he had been absorbed into the desert landscape itself. No reliable witness ever reported seeing him again. No body was ever found. No definitive account of his fate ever emerged from the chaos of revolutionary Mexico. He had entered a world where record-keeping was haphazard, where violence was commonplace, and where the disappearance of a single American writer would hardly have seemed remarkable among all the other casualties of the ongoing conflict. The search for Bierce began almost immediately after word of his disappearance reached the United States. Friends and admirers organized efforts to trace his movements in Mexico, following up on rumors and alleged sightings that led nowhere. The U.S. government made inquiries through diplomatic channels, but the revolutionary forces that controlled much of Mexico were hardly inclined to cooperate with American officials seeking information about a missing writer. Over the years, numerous theories emerged to explain what might have happened to Bierce. The most straightforward explanation was that he had been killed in the fighting, either as a combatant or as a casualty of the general violence that characterized the revolution. Mexico in 1913 was a dangerous place for anyone, but particularly for a foreigner who might have been viewed with suspicion by any of the various factions involved in the conflict. Another theory suggested that Bierce had indeed been executed, perhaps by firing squad, as he had seemed to anticipate in his final letters. This explanation had a certain dramatic appeal, as it would have provided the kind of meaningful death that Bierce appeared to have been seeking. However, no evidence was ever found to support this theory, and it remained purely speculative. More romantic theory proposed that Bierce had chosen to disappear voluntarily, that he had used the chaos of the revolution to stage his own vanishing, and had subsequently lived out his remaining years under an assumed identity. According to this theory, Bierce had grown tired of his old life and his old identity, and had seized the opportunity provided by the Mexican Revolution to reinvent himself completely. This theory was supported by the fact that Bierce was an intelligent and resourceful man who would have been capable of planning and executing such a disappearance. He had the literary imagination to conceive of such a dramatic exit from his old life, and he had the practical experience to understand how it might be accomplished. However, like the other theories about his fate, this explanation remained unsupported by concrete evidence. Some investigators suggested that Bierce might have been the victim of bandits or other criminals who preyed on travelers in the unsettled conditions of revolutionary Mexico. This explanation would account for his disappearance without requiring any elaborate conspiracy or dramatic confrontation with revolutionary forces. A simple robbery gone wrong, his body left in some remote location where it would never be found, would explain his fate as effectively as any more dramatic scenario. The search for Bierce continued sporadically for decades after his disappearance. Various individuals claimed to have information about his fate, and several expeditions were organized to investigate alleged grave sites or other locations where his remains might be found. None of these efforts produced any definitive results, and the mystery of his disappearance remained as impenetrable as ever. In 1919, a story emerged from Mexico claiming that Bierce had been killed during the siege of Ojinaga in January 1914. According to this account, he had been serving as an observer with Villa's forces when the town fell to federal troops, and he had been executed along with other prisoners. The story was detailed and seemed plausible, but investigators were never able to verify the claims or find any corroborating evidence. Another account, surfacing years later, suggested that Bierce had been present at the Battle of Tierra Blanca and had been killed during the fighting there. This story too had a certain plausibility, as the battle had been particularly fierce and many bodies were never recovered from the battlefield. But again, no definitive proof could be found to support the claim. Perhaps the most intriguing theory was proposed by those who knew Bierce well and understood his literary sensibilities. They suggested that his disappearance was itself a kind of artistic statement, the final work of a man who had spent his career exploring themes of death, irony, and the unexpected twists of fate. According to this interpretation, Bierce had crafted his own vanishing as carefully as he had crafted his stories, creating a mystery that would outlive him and ensure that his name would be remembered long after his contemporaries had been forgotten. This theory found support in the careful way that Bierce had prepared for his journey to Mexico. He had settled his affairs, destroyed many of his papers, and written letters that seemed designed to create maximum mystery about his intentions and his fate. His final correspondence had the quality of a literary work full of foreshadowing and symbolic meaning that seemed almost too perfect to be accidental. The idea that Bierce had choreographed his own disappearance appealed to those who admired his literary artistry and his understanding of dramatic effect. It suggested that even in death, or perhaps especially in death, he had remained true to his vision of life as an ironic drama, full of unexpected turns and unsolvable puzzles. As the years passed and the initial urgency of the search faded, the mystery of Ambrose Bierce's fate became part of American literary folklore. His disappearance was referenced in countless books and articles, analyzed by scholars and speculated about by amateur detectives who found the puzzle irresistible. Each new generation seemed to discover the mystery anew, bringing fresh perspectives and new theories to bear on the old questions. The revolutionary period in Mexico gradually ended, replaced by more stable governments that were better able to maintain records and communicate with foreign officials. But the passage of time only made the mystery more difficult to solve. As witnesses died, memories faded, and the physical evidence of what might have happened to Bierce disappeared into the vast anonymity of history. In the context of our quiet evening contemplation, the story of Ambrose Bierce invites us to consider the relationship between life and art, between reality and the stories we tell about reality. Here was a man who had spent his career crafting tales about the unpredictability of existence, about the way that fate could twist and turn in ways that defied all reasonable expectation. His own fate became perhaps his greatest story, a mystery that embodied all the themes that had fascinated him throughout his literary career. The desert winds that blow across the landscapes where Bierce vanished carry with them the dust of countless forgotten stories, the remains of lives that began with hope and ended in ways both expected and surprising. Somewhere in that vast expanse, the truth of what happened to Ambrose Bierce may still lie buried, waiting for some future discoverer to unearth it and finally provide the answer that has eluded us for more than a century. But perhaps the search itself is more valuable than any answer we might find. The mystery of Bierce's disappearance continues to remind us that even in our modern world of instant communication and global surveillance, it is still possible for someone to simply vanish, to step out of the known world and into the realm of pure speculation and wonder. As we allow ourselves to drift towards sleep, carried along by the gentle rhythm of this narrative, we might reflect on how some mysteries serve as gateways to larger questions about the nature of existence itself. The story of Ambrose Bierce is not just about one man's fate, but about the fundamental unpredictability of life, the thin line between the known and the unknown, and the enduring human fascination with stories that refuse to provide us with the neat resolutions we crave. December in Australia brings the warmth of summer, and in 1948, the beaches near Adelaide were popular destinations for those seeking relief from the heat. Somerton Beach, with its long stretch of sand and cooling ocean breezes, attracted visitors throughout the summer months. But on the morning of December 1st, beachgoers discovered something that would transform this peaceful location into the center of one of Australia's most enduring mysteries. A man lay on the beach, dressed in a suit despite the warm weather, positioned as if he had simply laid down to rest and never awakened. He appeared to be middle-aged, perhaps in his 40s, with a strong build and well-groomed appearance that suggested he was not a vagrant or someone living rough. His clothing was of good quality, his shoes were polished, and his overall presentation indicated a person who took care with his appearance and likely came from respectable circumstances. The discovery initially seemed straightforward enough to the police officers who responded to the call. People sometimes suffered heart attacks or other medical emergencies while walking along the beach, and the man's peaceful appearance suggested that whatever had befallen him had been sudden and not violent. But as the investigation began, it became apparent that this was no ordinary case of sudden death. The first puzzling discovery was that the man carried no identification of any kind. His pockets contained no wallet, no papers, no business cards, nothing that might indicate who he was or where he had come from. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. People sometimes lost their identification or chose to travel without it, for various personal reasons. What made this situation more mysterious was that all the labels had been carefully removed from his clothing, as if someone had deliberately attempted to conceal any clues about where the garments had been purchased or manufactured. The removal of the labels appeared to have been done systematically and with considerable care. Every tag, every manufacturer's mark, Every piece of identifying information that might normally be found in clothing had been precisely cut away. This was not the kind of damage that might result from normal wear or accidental tearing. It was clearly the result of deliberate action by someone who understood exactly what information such labels might provide to investigators. Dr. John Barclay Bennett, the pathologist who conducted the autopsy, found no obvious cause of death. The man showed no signs of violence, no injuries that might have proven fatal, no evidence of any struggle or attack. His internal organs appeared healthy for a man of his apparent age, with no indication of disease or natural causes that might explain his death. Blood tests revealed no trace of common poisons or drugs that might have been administered to cause his demise. However, Dr. Bennett did observe some unusual characteristics that would become important elements in the ongoing mystery. The man's calf muscles were unusually well developed, suggesting that he was accustomed to regular walking or running. His hands were soft and showed no signs of manual labor, indicating that whatever his occupation might have been, it was not one that required physical work. Most intriguingly, his teeth showed signs of unusual wear patterns that suggested he might have been a smoker. Though no tobacco or smoking materials were found with his body, the investigation expanded to include inquiries at local hotels, boarding houses, and other accommodations where the man might have been staying. Police officers canvassed the area around Somerton Beach, showing photographs of the deceased to hotel clerks, restaurant workers, and anyone else who might have encountered him in the days before his death. Despite these extensive efforts, no one could be found who remembered seeing the man or who could provide any information about his identity or his activities in Adelaide. Missing person reports were examined from across Australia and even from other countries in case the man might have been a visitor from overseas. Photographs were circulated to police departments throughout the region, and inquiries were made through diplomatic channels in case he might have been a foreign national. All of these efforts proved fruitless. No missing person report matched the description of the Somerton man as he came to be known. Asterisk, the case took an even more mysterious turn 6 months later, when a more thorough examination of the man's clothing revealed a small pocket sewn into his trousers, so well concealed that it had been overlooked during the initial investigation. Inside this hidden pocket was a small piece of paper with the words "Tamam Shud" printed on it. The phrase was unfamiliar to the investigators, but scholarly consultation revealed that it was a Persian phrase meaning ended or finished, and that it was commonly used as the final words in collections of Persian poetry. Further investigation determined that paper fragment had been torn from a specific book, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a collection of Persian poetry that had been translated into English and was popular among educated readers of the time. The discovery of this clue led to a renewed search for the source of the paper fragment, and eventually, a copy of the book was found that was missing the final page, where the phrase "Tamam Shud" would have appeared. The book was discovered in the unlocked car of a man who had been parked near Somerton Beach around the time of the discovery of the body. When contacted by police, the car's owner reported that he had noticed the book in his car after returning from the beach, though he had no memory of placing it there and insisted that it did not belong to him. The timing and location of this discovery seemed too coincidental to be accidental, suggesting that someone had deliberately placed the book in the car, perhaps as a message or clue of some kind. Examination of the book revealed additional mysteries. On the back cover, written in pencil, was a series of letters that appeared to be some kind of code. WRGOABABD on the first line, MLIAOI on the second, and Twtempen on the third. Below these cryptic letters was what appeared to be a telephone number that had been crossed out, but was still partially legible. The telephone number led investigators to a woman living in the Adelaide area. When contacted, she denied any knowledge of the dead man or any connection to the case. However, her reaction to being shown the book of poetry suggested that she recognized it, though she continued to insist that she knew nothing about the mysterious death at Somerton Beach. The woman, who was referred to in police reports only as Justin to protect her privacy, became a person of interest in the case. Though no evidence was ever found to definitively link her to the victim, Justin's background added another layer of complexity to the mystery. During World War II, she had worked as a nurse and had some connection to people involved in intelligence work. Some investigators theorized that the Somerton man might have been involved in espionage activities, possibly related to the early years of the Cold War. Australia's geographic position made it strategically important in the emerging conflict between the Western powers and the Soviet Union, and there were known instances of intelligence operatives working in the region. During this period, the coded letters found in the book attracted considerable attention from cryptographers and amateur code breakers, but despite decades of analysis, no one has ever been able to definitively decipher their meaning. Some experts have suggested that the letters might not be a code at all, but rather an abbreviation for a poem or song, or possibly just random letters with no particular significance. Others have proposed elaborate theories about sophisticated encryption methods that might have been used to conceal vital intelligence information. The case captured the imagination of the Australian public and eventually gained international attention as one of the world's great unsolved mysteries. The combination of the unidentified victim, the mysterious circumstances of his death, the carefully removed clothing labels, and the cryptic clues found with his body created a puzzle that seemed to have stepped out of the pages of a spy novel or detective story. Various theories emerged to explain the identity and fate of the Somerton man. Some investigators believe he was a spy, either working for or against Western intelligence agencies, who had been eliminated by his opponents. This theory was supported by the timing of his death, which occurred during the early years of the Cold War, when intelligence activities were intensifying around the world. The sophisticated method of concealing his identity and the cryptic clues left behind were consistent with the kinds of techniques that might be employed by intelligence operatives. Another theory suggested that the man was the victim of a personal crime, perhaps a love triangle or business dispute that had escalated to murder. The connection to Justin, however tenuous, suggested that there might have been personal relationships involved that had somehow led to tragedy. The romantic poetry and the careful staging of the death might have been elements in a crime of passion rather than a matter of international intrigue. A third possibility was that the man had committed suicide, perhaps as the result of unrequited love or some other personal tragedy. The peaceful nature of his death and the location where his body was found were consistent with someone who had chosen to end his life in a quiet, contemplative setting. The mysterious clues might have been his attempt to leave behind a puzzle that would ensure his death was remembered and investigated, even if his identity remained unknown. Over the years, advances in forensic science have been applied to the case in the hope of finally resolving the mystery. Attempts have been made to extract DNA from hair and other biological materials associated with the body, though the techniques available in the 1940s and the passage of time have made this challenging. Some progress has been made in analyzing the remains using modern methods, but no definitive identification has yet been achieved. The case has also been examined using modern techniques for analyzing handwriting, photography, and other physical evidence. Computer analysis of the coded letters has been attempted using sophisticated algorithms designed to detect patterns that might not be apparent to human analysts. Despite all these efforts, the essential mystery remains unsolved. In recent years, there has been renewed interest in the case, partly due to advances in DNA analysis and genealogical research techniques. Some investigators have suggested that it might now be possible to identify the Somerton man through comparison of his DNA with genetic databases that have been established for genealogical research. However, The degraded condition of the biological materials and the legal and ethical considerations involved in such testing have made progress slow and difficult. The story of the Somerton man represents one of those rare cases that seems to exist at the intersection of reality and fiction, where the circumstances are so unusual and mysterious that they challenge our basic assumptions about how such puzzles can be solved. The case has inspired numerous books, documentaries, and academic studies, each attempting to shed new light on the mystery or propose new theories about what might have happened on that summer morning in 1948. As we consider this enigmatic case, in the peaceful quiet of our evening, we might reflect on how some mysteries seem to grow more rather than less complex as time passes and new information emerges. Each clue that is discovered, each theory that is proposed, seems to add new layers to the puzzle rather than bringing us closer to a definitive solution. The Somerton beach where the unknown man was found continues to attract visitors, most of whom are unaware of the mystery that once focused international attention on this quiet stretch of Australian coastline. The waves continue to wash against the shore with the same eternal rhythm that they have maintained for countless centuries, carrying with them the whispered secrets of all those who have walked along the water's edge and then disappeared into the vast anonymity of time. Perhaps the enduring fascination of the Somerton man case lies not in any particular detail of the mystery, but in what it represents about the fundamental unknowability of human existence. Here was a man who lived a full life, who had relationships and experiences and probably hopes and dreams just like anyone else, but whose story ended in such a way that all traces of his identity and his history were erased, leaving behind only questions and speculation. In our modern world of databases and surveillance and digital records, it seems almost impossible that someone could simply vanish without a trace, that a human life could be reduced to a series of unsolved puzzles. But the case of the Somerton man reminds us that mystery and anonymity can still exist, that there are still corners of human experience that resist our attempts to catalog and explain them. As the gentle rhythm of this narrative carries us toward rest, we might find a strange comfort in knowing that some stories will always remain unfinished, some questions will always remain unanswered. The mystery of the Somerton man stands as a reminder that the world is still full of wonder and uncertainty, still capable of presenting us with puzzles that humble our confidence in our ability to understand everything around us. Asterisk in the rolling countryside of Bavaria, where ancient forests meet cultivated fields and the rhythm of rural life has remained unchanged for centuries, there stands a farmstead that has become synonymous with one of Germany's most chilling unsolved mysteries. The name Hinterkaifeck evokes images of a peaceful agricultural setting where generations of families might have lived and worked in harmony with the land. But this particular farm would become the scene of a crime so brutal and mysterious that it would haunt investigators and capture imaginations for more than a century. The year was 1922, and Germany was still reeling from the aftermath of the Great War. The countryside, however, remained largely insulated from the political turmoil and economic uncertainty that plagued the cities. Rural Bavaria continued to follow the ancient patterns of farming life, where families worked their land, tended their animals, and lived in relative isolation from the wider world. The Gruber family had farmed at Hinterkaifeck for many years. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, was a man in his 60s who had spent his entire life working the soil and raising livestock. He was known to be somewhat difficult and suspicious by nature, a man who kept to himself and was not quick to trust outsiders. His wife Kazelia was several years younger and helped maintain the household, while also assisting with the farm work, as was customary for women of her station and time living. With them was their daughter, Victoria Gabriel, a widow whose husband had died during the war. Victoria had 2 children, 7-year-old Kazelia, named for her grandmother, and 2-year-old Joseph. The family was completed by their maid, Maria Baumgartner. a young woman from the nearby town who helped with the domestic duties and childcare that kept the large household functioning. The farmstead itself was typical of the region, a collection of sturdy buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with the main house serving as both residence and workspace. The barn housed the cattle and stored hay and grain, while smaller outbuildings provided space for tools, equipment, and the various necessities of agricultural life. The farm was located in a somewhat isolated area, with the nearest neighbors living at distances that might require a substantial walk across fields and through wooded areas. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy that would make Hinterkaifeck famous, Andreas Gruber had noticed several disturbing incidents that had left him feeling uneasy and suspicious. He had found footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the forest to his farm buildings, but the tracks did not continue beyond the farmyard, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished. When he followed the prints back toward the forest, they seemed to disappear at the tree line, leaving him puzzled about who might have been watching his property and why. More troubling still, Andreas had discovered that someone had been in his house while the family was away. Tools had been moved, and there were signs that an intruder had spent time in the attic space above the main living areas. When he investigated, he found evidence that someone had been sleeping there, though he could not determine how long the person had been using the space, or whether they were still on the property. These discoveries had made Andreas increasingly paranoid and worried about the safety of his family. He had spoken to neighbors about the strange incidents, though his naturally suspicious nature made him reluctant to seek help from outside authorities. The local police were located in a distant town, and the idea of involving them in Kopel police were located in a distant town, and the idea of involving them in what might have been simple trespassing seemed both unnecessary and potentially troublesome. Andreas had also mentioned to several people that he had been hearing strange noises at night, sounds that suggested someone was moving around the farm buildings after dark. He had investigated these disturbances on several occasions, but had never been able to find any evidence of intruders or any explanation for the sounds that had awakened him. The family's maid, Maria Baumgartner, had also become increasingly uncomfortable about the situation at the farm. She had given notice that she would be leaving her position, citing her unease about the strange incidents that had been occurring. Her replacement was scheduled to arrive on April 1st, 1922, but the new maid never appeared for her first day of work, apparently having decided against taking the position at the last moment. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, the Gruber family followed their usual routines, unaware that they were living through their final hours. Andreas completed his evening chores, checking on the livestock and securing the farm buildings for the night. Kazelia prepared the evening meal and tended to the domestic tasks that filled her days. Victoria cared for her young children, 7-year-old Kazelia and little Joseph, helping them prepare for bed and listening to their childish chatter about the events of their day. The family retired for the night in what appeared to be normal circumstances, though the strange incidents of recent weeks may have left them feeling somewhat unsettled and alert to unusual sounds. The farmhouse settled into the quiet rhythms of night, with only the usual sounds of wind in the trees and the occasional noise from the barn animals to disturb the peace of the Bavarian countryside. What happened during the dark hours that followed remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the Hinterkaifeck case. Sometime during the night or early morning hours, an unknown intruder entered the farm property and methodically murdered 6 people, leaving behind a crime scene that would baffle investigators and horrify the local community. The murders were discovered on April 4th, 1922, when neighbors became concerned that no one had been seen around the Hinterkaifeck farm for several days. The absence of activity was unusual enough to warrant investigation, as farming communities depended on daily routines and regular contact between neighbors for both practical and social reasons. When the neighbors investigated, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. 5 members of the household had been brutally murdered with what appeared to be a farm implement, possibly a mattock or similar tool. The victims had suffered severe head trauma, and the violence of the attack suggested a level of rage or determination that went far beyond what would have been necessary to simply rob the family or silence potential witnesses. Andreas Gruber was found in the barn, along with his wife Kazelia and their daughter Victoria. The 7-year-old granddaughter, also named Kazelia, was discovered with them. All 4 had been struck repeatedly with the blunt instrument, and their injuries indicated that they had been killed quickly and efficiently, without any apparent opportunity to defend themselves or escape from their attacker. The most disturbing discovery was the body of 2-year-old Joseph, who was found in his bed in the main house. Unlike the other victims, Joseph appeared to have survived the initial attack, as evidence suggested that he had lived for several hours after the murders of the other family members. The killer had apparently returned to the house and murdered the child sometime after completing the other killings, a detail that added an additional layer of horror to an already shocking crime. The body of the maid, Maria Baumgartner, was found in her quarters, also killed by blows to the head from the same weapon that had been used on the family members. The systematic nature of the killing suggested that the murderer had been familiar with the layout of the farm and had known where to find each victim, eliminating them methodically to ensure that no one survived to identify the attacker. Investigation that followed revealed additional puzzling details that made the case even more mysterious. There was evidence that the killer had remained on the farm for several days after committing the murders, living in the house and caring for the animals as if nothing had happened. The livestock had been fed and watered, and there were signs that meals had been prepared and consumed in the kitchen. Most bizarrely, neighbors reported that they had seen smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney during the days between the murders, and the discovery of the bodies indicating that someone had been maintaining fires for warmth and cooking. The killer had apparently felt comfortable enough to remain on the property for an extended period, either unaware that the bodies would eventually be discovered or unconcerned about the risk of being caught. The methodical nature of the crime and the killer's apparent familiarity with the farm led investigators to focus their attention on people who knew the family and their routines. However, Andreas Gruber's suspicious and somewhat antisocial nature meant that he had relatively few close relationships outside his immediate family, making it difficult to identify likely suspects. One theory that gained considerable attention focused on Victoria Gabriel's relationship with her deceased husband and the circumstances surrounding his death. There were rumors that Victoria had been involved in an extramarital relationship, and some investigators wondered if the murders might have been connected to jealousy or revenge related to these alleged romantic complications. However, no concrete evidence was ever found to support this theory. Another line of investigation examined the possibility that Andreas Gruber had discovered something about the mysterious intruder who had been living in his attic, and that the murders had been committed to prevent him from reporting this discovery to authorities. This theory suggested that the killer might have been a vagrant or fugitive who had been using the farm as a hideout and had decided to eliminate the family rather than risk exposure. The political climate of post-war Germany also provided a context for theories about the motive behind the Hinterkaifeck murders. The country was experiencing significant social and economic upheaval, and there were various extremist groups operating in rural areas. Some investigators wondered if the family might have been targeted for political reasons, or if they had somehow become involved in conflicts related to the changing political landscape of the time. Asterisk. Despite extensive investigation by local police and later by more sophisticated investigative units, no arrest was ever made in connection with the Hinterkaifeck murders. The case remained active for many years, with periodic reviews and new investigations as forensic techniques and investigative methods improved. However, The passage of time and the destruction of evidence during World War II made it increasingly difficult to solve the case definitively. Over the decades, numerous theories and suspects have been proposed by both professional investigators and amateur sleuths fascinated by the mystery. Some of these theories have focused on specific individuals who had connections to the family or who were known to have been in the area at the time of the murders. Others have proposed more elaborate explanations involving conspiracy, political motivation, or connections to other unsolved crimes of the period. The Hinterkaifeck case has become a staple of German crime literature and has attracted international attention as one of Europe's most notorious unsolved mysteries. The combination of the brutal nature of the crime, the mysterious circumstances surrounding it, and the failure of investigators to identify the killer has made it a subject of enduring fascination for those interested in true crime and historical mysteries. Modern forensic techniques have been applied to the case in recent years, as investigators have attempted to use DNA analysis and other advanced methods to identify the killer, or at least narrow down the list of possible suspects. However, the degradation of physical evidence over time and the loss of materials during the war years have limited the effectiveness of these efforts. The farmstead at Hinterkaifeck was eventually demolished, and the land has been used for other purposes, but the memory of the tragic events that occurred there continues to resonate in the local community and beyond. The case stands as a reminder of how violence can intrude into even the most peaceful and isolated settings, and how some crimes can resist all attempts at solution, despite decades of investigation and analysis. As we contemplate this dark chapter from the Bavarian countryside, we might reflect on how certain crimes seem to transcend their specific time and place to become part of the broader human story about mystery, violence, and the search for justice. The Hinterkaifeck murders represent not just a tragic loss of life, but a puzzle that has challenged our understanding of human nature and our confidence in our ability to solve even the most complex crimes. In the quiet hours of our evening reflection, the story of Hinterkaifeck invites us to consider the thin line between safety and danger, between the known and the unknown, that exists even in the most seemingly secure environments. The peaceful rhythms of rural life that characterized the Gruber family's existence were shattered by an act of violence that seemed to come from nowhere and leave behind only questions that have echoed through the decades. The mystery endures, as compelling today as it was when the first investigators walked through the blood-stained rooms of the farmhouse more than a century ago. It reminds us that some stories resist all our attempts to understand them completely, remaining as enigmatic and troubling as they were when they first captured our attention and refused to let it go. London, in the summer of 1483, was a city caught between seasons of power, where the very stones of the tower seemed to whisper secrets that would echo through the centuries. The massive fortress that had stood guard over the Thames for 400 years had witnessed countless moments of triumph and tragedy, but few mysteries would prove as enduring or as haunting as the fate of two young boys who entered its walls that summer and were never seen again. Edward V was just 12 years old when he became King of England following the death of his father, Edward IV, in April 1483. The boy king was fair-haired and slight of build, with the kind of earnest demeanor that might have served him well in peaceful times but seemed almost fragile in the brutal political climate of late medieval England. His younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, was only 9, a child who should have been playing with wooden toys and learning his letters, not navigating the treacherous currents of royal succession. The England of 1483 was a realm still wounded by decades of civil war between the houses of York and Lancaster, conflicts that had torn noble families apart and left the crown vulnerable to challenge from multiple claimants. The death of Edward IV had created a power vacuum that various factions were eager to fill, and the two young princes found themselves at the center of machinations that were far beyond their understanding or control. Their uncle, Richard Duke, of Gloucester had been appointed as Lord Protector during Edward V's minority, a position that placed him in effective control of the kingdom until the young king came of age. Richard was an experienced military commander and administrator who had served his brother Edward IV loyally for many years. But the prospect of decades serving as regent for a boy king, followed by a lifetime in the shadow of his nephew's rule, may have awakened ambitions that had previously remained dormant. The political situation became increasingly complex as various noble factions maneuvered for influence over the young king. The Woodville family, relatives of the boy's mother Elizabeth Woodville, had enjoyed considerable power during Edward IV's reign and were determined to maintain their position. Other noble houses saw the transition as an opportunity to settle old scores or advance their own interests, creating a web of alliances and enmities that made the royal court a dangerous place for anyone, especially two vulnerable children. In May 1483, Richard moved decisively to consolidate his power. He arrested several members of the Woodville faction, including Anthony Woodville, the boy's uncle and guardian, who was subsequently executed on charges of treason. Elizabeth Woodville, sensing the danger to her family, fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her younger children, leaving Edward V in the custody of his uncle Richard. The young king was brought to the Tower of London, ostensibly for his own protection and to prepare for his coronation, which was scheduled for late June. The tower served not only as a fortress and prison, but also as a royal residence, and it was traditional for monarchs to stay there before their coronation ceremonies. The massive stone walls and well-defended position made it the safest place in London for a young king whose claim to the throne was already being questioned by various factions. In June, Richard made a move that would prove to be pivotal in the unfolding drama. He persuaded Elizabeth Woodville to allow her younger son, Richard, Duke of York, to join his brother in the Tower. The official reason was that the boy should be present for his brother's coronation, and that the two princes would be safer together than separated. Elizabeth Woodville, despite her obvious reluctance and growing fears about Richard's intentions, eventually agreed to release her younger son from sanctuary. The reunion of the two brothers in the Tower was witnessed by various courtiers and servants, who later described seeing the boys playing together in the gardens and walking along the battlements under the supervision of their guardians. For a brief time, it seemed that the arrangement might work, that the young king and his brother could remain in safety, while the complex political negotiations surrounding the coronation continued. But even as the boys settled into their quarters in the Tower, events were unfolding that would seal their fate. Richard's supporters had begun questioning the legitimacy of Edward V's claim to the throne, raising doubts about the validity of his parents' marriage and suggesting that the young king was therefore illegitimate. These claims, whether sincere or merely convenient, provided Richard with a legal justification for what many suspected he had been planning all along. On June 22, 1483, a clergyman named Ralph Shaw preached a sermon at Paul's Cross in London, publicly declaring that Edward IV's children were illegitimate and that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was therefore the rightful king. The sermon was followed by a petition from Parliament asking Richard to accept the crown, a request that he agreed to after what appeared to be appropriate reluctance and deliberation. Richard was crowned King Richard III on July 6, 1483, in a ceremony that was magnificent in its display, but shadowed by the unresolved question of what would happen to his nephews. The two boys, no longer needed to legitimize the succession, but potentially dangerous as rallying points for future rebellions, remained in the Tower as their uncle consolidated his hold on power. The last reliable sightings of the two princes date to sometime in the summer of 1483. Various witnesses reported seeing them playing in the Tower gardens and walking along the walls, but as the weeks passed, these sightings became less frequent and eventually ceased altogether. When inquiries were made about the boys' welfare, officials provided evasive answers that did little to calm growing concerns about their safety. By autumn 1483, rumors were spreading throughout London and beyond that the two princes were dead, murdered on the orders of their uncle to eliminate any threat they might pose to his rule. These rumors were impossible to verify, as access to the tower was strictly controlled, and Richard's supporters were unlikely to provide information that might implicate the king in such a heinous crime. But the complete disappearance of two boys, who had previously been visible to various courtiers and servants, seemed to suggest that something terrible had indeed occurred. The rumors of the princes' deaths became a significant political liability for Richard III, undermining his legitimacy and providing his enemies with a powerful propaganda weapon. Henry Tudor, who had a tenuous claim to the throne through his mother's Lancastrian lineage, was able to present himself as a liberator who would restore rightful rule to England and bring justice for the murdered princes when Henry Tudor invaded England in 1485 and defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. One of his first acts as Henry VII was to launch an investigation into the fate of the princes. However, this investigation proved to be limited in scope and effectiveness, possibly because Henry's own claim to the throne was weak and he preferred not to draw too much attention to questions of royal legitimacy. The mystery of what happened to the princes in the tower has generated countless theories and investigations over the more than 5 centuries that have passed since their disappearance. The most straightforward explanation, accepted by many historians, is that Richard III ordered their murder shortly after his coronation, eliminating potential threats to his rule in the brutal but practical manner typical of medieval politics. This theory is supported by the timing of the disappearances, which coincided with Richard's consolidation of power, and by the political logic of the situation, which made the prince's continued existence problematic for the new king. Various accounts from the Tudor period, including the writings of Thomas More, provided detailed descriptions of how the murders were allegedly carried out, though these sources were written years after the events and may have been influenced by Tudor propaganda designed to blacken Richard's reputation. Alternative theories have suggested that the princes may have been killed by other parties with their own motives for eliminating potential claimants to the throne. Henry Tudor himself had reason to want the boys dead, as their existence would have complicated his own claim to royal legitimacy. Other noble families who had suffered during the Wars of the Roses might have seen the elimination of the York princes as a form of revenge or political necessity. Some historians have even proposed that one or both of the princes may have survived and lived out their lives in obscurity, hidden away to protect them from the dangerous world of royal politics. This theory suggests that the rumors of their deaths may have been deliberately encouraged to protect them from further attempts on their lives, allowing them to live safely away from court intrigue and succession disputes. In 1674, during renovations at the Tower of London, workmen discovered a wooden box containing the skeletons of 2 children buried beneath a staircase. The remains were examined and declared to be those of the missing princes, and they were subsequently interred in Westminster Abbey in a tomb designed by Christopher Wren. However, the scientific techniques available in the 17th century were insufficient to definitively identify the remains or determine the cause of death. Modern scientific analysis of the bones has been proposed on several occasions, but the Church of England has been reluctant to disturb the remains, and various technical and political considerations have prevented comprehensive forensic examination. The bones remain in their tomb at Westminster Abbey, their secrets locked away perhaps as securely as they were in the Tower of London more than 500 years ago. The case of the princes in the Tower has become one of the most debated topics in English history, inspiring countless books, articles, and dramatic works that have attempted to solve the mystery, or at least shed new light on the available evidence. The Richard III Society, founded to rehabilitate the reputation of the king traditionally blamed for the princes' deaths, has sponsored extensive research into the case and promoted alternative theories about what might have happened to the boys. Recent archaeological discoveries, including the identification of Richard III's remains in a Leicester car park in 2012, have renewed interest in the case and provided new insights into the character and motivations of the man who was most likely responsible for the prince's fate. However, these discoveries have not provided definitive answers to the central questions about what happened to Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, during those mysterious summer months in 1483. As we contemplate this ancient mystery in the quiet of our evening reflection, we might consider how the story of the princes in the tower speaks to timeless themes about power, innocence, and the terrible vulnerability of children caught in the machinations of adult ambition. The two boys who entered the tower that summer were victims not only of whoever ultimately determined their fate, but of a political system that treated royal children as pawns in a game they were too young to understand. The grey stones of the Tower of London have witnessed countless tragedies over the centuries, but few have captured the imagination as completely as the disappearance of two young princes, whose only crime was being born into a world where their very existence posed a threat to others' ambitions. The mystery endures not only because of the unanswered questions about their fate, but because their story reminds us of the human cost of political struggle and the way that innocence can be crushed by forces beyond its control or comprehension. The year 1872 found the merchant vessel Mary Celeste cutting through the Atlantic swells on what should have been a routine voyage from New York to Genoa, her holds filled with commercial alcohol and her crew anticipating the profits that would come from a successful delivery. The brigantine was a sturdy ship, well-built and properly maintained, with an experienced captain who had earned the respect of shipowners and sailors alike. But this voyage would transform the Mary Celeste from an ordinary merchant vessel into one of maritime history's most enduring mysteries. Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs was a man of 41 years whose life had been shaped by the sea and the demands of commercial sailing. Born into a seafaring family on Cape Cod, he'd learned navigation and seamanship from childhood, working his way up through the ranks until he could command vessels of his own. His reputation among ship owners was excellent. He was known as a competent sailor, a fair leader, and a man whose religious convictions made him reliable and trustworthy in a profession where character was often more valuable than technical skill. The crew that Briggs had assembled for the voyage to Genoa reflected his careful approach to maritime leadership. Each man had been selected for his skills and experience, and together they formed a capable team that could handle the challenges of Atlantic sailing in the unpredictable weather of late autumn. The first mate, Albert Richardson, was an experienced sailor who had served on numerous voyages and could be trusted to maintain discipline and manage the crew in the captain's absence. The second mate and the remaining crew members were all competent seamen who understood their duties and could be relied upon to perform them effectively. What made this voyage unusual was that Captain Briggs had decided to bring his wife, Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, along for the journey. This was not entirely uncommon in the merchant marine of the period, as captains' families sometimes accompanied them on longer voyages, but it did add an element of domestic life to what was normally an exclusively masculine environment. Sarah Briggs was an experienced sea traveler who had accompanied her husband on previous voyages, and she was well prepared for the challenges of life aboard ship. The Mary Celeste departed from New York on November 7, 1872, with fair weather and favorable winds that promised a smooth Atlantic crossing. The ship's manifest recorded her cargo as 1,700 barrels of denatured alcohol, a valuable shipment that would be used for industrial purposes in Italy. The vessel was properly provisioned for the journey, with sufficient food, water, and supplies to sustain the captain's family and the crew for the expected duration of the voyage. For the first few weeks, the voyage proceeded normally. The Mary Celeste made good time across the Atlantic, and there was no reason to expect anything other than a successful completion of the journey. Captain Briggs maintained his usual careful records of the ship's position, weather conditions, and other details that would be essential for navigation and for documenting the voyage for the ship's owners. The last entry in the ship's log was made on November 25, 1872, when the Mary Celeste was approximately 400 miles west of Portugal. The entry indicated that the ship was making good progress and that conditions were favorable for continuing the voyage toward the Mediterranean. There was nothing in the record to suggest any problems with the ship, the crew, or the cargo that might have created concern about the vessel's safety or the successful completion of the journey. It was on December 4, 1872, that the British brigantine Dei Gratia, under the command of Captain David Morehouse, spotted a vessel sailing erratically in the waters between Spain and Portugal. The ship was identified as the Mary Celeste, and initial observation suggested that something was seriously wrong. The vessel was under partial sail but appeared to be unmanned, yawing unpredictably with the wind and waves rather than maintaining a steady course toward any particular destination. Captain Morehouse knew Captain Briggs personally and was aware that the Mary Celeste had left New York several weeks earlier bound for Genoa. The erratic behavior of the vessel was completely inconsistent with Briggs's reputation as a careful and competent mariner, and Morehouse immediately suspected that some disaster had befallen the ship and her crew. The boarding party that Morehouse sent to investigate the Mary Celeste discovered a scene that was both puzzling and disturbing. The ship was completely abandoned with no sign of Captain Briggs, his family, or any of the crew members. However, the vessel was in remarkably good condition, with no evidence of violence, struggle, or any catastrophic event that might have forced the occupants to abandon ship. The ship's cargo was largely intact, with only a few barrels of alcohol showing signs of leakage. The personal belongings of the captain's family were still in their cabin, including valuable items that would not have been left behind in any normal evacuation. The crew's quarters contained their personal effects, and there was no indication that anyone had hurriedly gathered belongings before leaving the vessel. Most mysteriously, the ship's papers were missing, along with the navigation instruments and the ship's boat. The missing boat suggested that the occupants of the Mary Celeste had left the vessel deliberately rather than being swept overboard by rough weather or some other maritime disaster. But the reason for this abandonment remained completely unclear. As the ship appeared to be seaworthy and in no immediate danger, the investigation that followed the discovery of the abandoned Mary Celeste generated numerous theories about what might have happened to the 10 people who had vanished from the vessel. The most straightforward explanation was that some emergency had convinced Captain Briggs that the ship was in imminent danger of sinking, leading him to order an immediate abandonment. However, the good condition of the vessel made this explanation difficult to accept, as there was no evidence of any problem serious enough to justify such drastic action. Another theory focused on the cargo of denatured alcohol, suggesting that fumes from the leaking barrels might have created a risk of explosion. That convinced the captain to evacuate the ship temporarily. According to this explanation, Captain Briggs might have ordered everyone into the ship's boat to wait at a safe distance while the alcohol fumes dissipated, but then been unable to return to the vessel due to weather conditions or other factors. More sinister theories suggested that the Mary Celeste might have been the victim of piracy or mutiny. The missing ship's papers and navigation instruments could have been taken by attackers who wanted to conceal the ship's identity and destination. However, the lack of evidence of violence and the fact that valuable cargo and personal items were left untouched made this explanation seem unlikely. Some investigators wondered if the crew might have mutinied against Captain Briggs, perhaps motivated by dissatisfaction with their treatment or by the opportunity to steal the valuable cargo. This theory suggested that the mutineers might have forced the captain and his family into the ship's boat and then abandoned them at sea before making their escape. However, Captain Briggs's reputation for fair treatment of his crews made mutiny seem improbable. The possibility of insurance fraud was also considered, as the discovery of an abandoned but undamaged vessel would allow the owners to claim compensation while potentially recovering the ship and cargo as well. However, investigation into the financial circumstances of the ship's owners revealed no evidence of economic distress that might have motivated such a scheme. Natural disasters, including seaquakes or waterspouts, were proposed as possible explanations for the abandonment. According to these theories, some sudden geological or meteorological event might have convinced Captain Briggs that his ship was in immediate danger, leading to a hasty evacuation that proved to be unnecessary. The subsequent separation of the ship's boat from the vessel could have resulted in the deaths of all aboard, while the Mary Celeste continued sailing unmanned until she was discovered by the Dei Gratia. The legal proceedings that followed the discovery of the Mary Celeste were complicated by questions about salvage rights and by suspicions that the crew of the Dei Gratia might have been involved in whatever had happened to the missing people. Captain Morehouse and his crew were eventually awarded salvage compensation, but the amount was much smaller than they had hoped, reflecting the court's lingering doubts about their account of the discovery. Over the years, the Mary Celeste case has attracted attention from investigators, writers, and amateur sleuths who have proposed increasingly elaborate theories about the fate of Captain Briggs and the others who vanished from the vessel. Some of these theories have involved exotic explanations, including sea monsters, supernatural forces, or encounters with other vessels that resulted in the removal of all hands for unknown reasons. The case has also been the subject of numerous fictional treatments that have often confused the historical record with imaginary details. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a short story based on the Mary Celeste mystery, though he changed the name of the vessel and added fictional elements that have subsequently been mistaken for historical facts by some writers and researchers. Modern analysis of the case has focused on the technical aspects of 19th century sailing and the specific conditions that the Mary Celeste would have encountered during her final voyage. Some maritime experts have suggested that the combination of weather conditions, the nature of the cargo, and the normal challenges of Atlantic sailing might have created a situation that led to a rational decision to abandon ship, even though that decision ultimately proved to be unnecessary and fatal. The wreck of the Mary Celeste was eventually located off the coast of Haiti, where the vessel had been deliberately run aground in 1885 as part of an insurance fraud scheme unrelated to the original mystery. The ship's final fate thus involved the kind of maritime crime that had been suspected, but never proven in connection with the disappearance of her crew and passengers. 13 years earlier, the enduring fascination with the Mary Celeste mystery reflects our deep-seated unease with unexplained disappearances and our desire to find rational explanations for events that seem to defy logical analysis. The case combines elements of maritime adventure, family tragedy, and unsolved crime in a way that continues to capture imaginations more than a century and a half after the abandoned ship was first spotted drifting in the Atlantic. As we reflect on this maritime mystery in the peaceful quiet of our evening, we might consider how the story of the Mary Celeste speaks to our fundamental fear of the unknown and our recognition of how quickly the familiar and secure can be transformed into the mysterious and threatening. The 10 people who vanished from the brigantine were living ordinary lives, pursuing ordinary goals, when they encountered whatever force or circumstance removed them from the historical record as completely as if they had never existed. The vast ocean that claimed them continues to hold its secrets, indifferent to our desire for answers and explanations. Somewhere beneath the Atlantic waves, the truth of what happened to Captain Briggs, his family, and his crew may still lie waiting for discovery. or it may have been lost forever to the eternal silence of the deep waters that have witnessed so many human dramas and kept so many human secrets. Asterisk. The sultry nights of New Orleans in 1918 carried more than the usual humidity and the distant sound of jazz drifting from the French Quarter. They carried fear, whispered conversations, and the constant awareness that somewhere in the shadowed streets of the city, a killer moved with an intelligence and cunning that made him seem almost supernatural to those who lived in terror of his next appearance. The Axeman, as the newspapers would eventually christen him, began his reign of terror in May 1918, though some investigators would later suggest that his activities might have begun earlier and simply gone unrecognized as the work of a single individual. New Orleans in this period was a city in transition, struggling with the social and economic disruptions caused by World War I, while maintaining its unique cultural identity as a crossroads of American, French, Spanish, and Caribbean influences. City's population was diverse and often segregated, with different neighborhoods maintaining distinct ethnic and cultural characteristics. The Italian-American community, which would bear the brunt of the Axeman's attacks, was concentrated in certain areas of the city where families had established grocery stores, restaurants, and other small businesses that served both their own community and the broader population of New Orleans. It was in this environment that the Axeman struck for the first time on the night of May 22, 1918, when he attacked Joseph and Catherine Maggio in their home above their grocery store. The couple, both Italian immigrants who had built a modest but successful business, were found by Joseph's brothers the following morning, both dead from severe wounds inflicted by what appeared to be an axe or similar heavy-bladed weapon. Crime scene revealed several disturbing characteristics that would become hallmarks of the Axeman's methodology. The killer had apparently entered the Maggio home by removing a panel from the back door, a technique that required both skill and patience. Once inside, he had attacked the sleeping couple with savage efficiency, using what appeared to be their own axe, which was found at the scene covered in blood. But perhaps most unsettling was the evidence that the killer had remained in the house. After committing the murders, possibly searching through the premises or simply lingering to admire his handiwork. There were signs that he had moved methodically through the rooms, and neighbors later reported hearing strange sounds from the house during the early morning hours that suggested someone had been active there long after the murders had been completed. The investigation into the Maggio murders initially focused on the possibility of robbery, as Italian grocers were known to keep cash on their premises and might have been targeted by criminals seeking easy money. However, the amount of money found at the scene suggested that robbery had not been the primary motive, and the savage nature of the attack seemed to indicate something more personal and disturbing than simple theft. As summer progressed, additional attacks confirmed that the Maggio murders had not been an isolated incident. On June 28th, Louis B. Zoomer and his mistress Annie Lowe were attacked in their home, both suffering severe head wounds from an axe-wielding assailant. The Zoomer survived the attack, though he was left with permanent injuries, while Lowe died from her wounds after lingering in the hospital for several weeks. The pattern established in the Maggio case was repeated with disturbing consistency. The killer had entered through a door or window that had been carefully opened or modified to provide access, and he had used an axe or similar weapon that was either found at the scene or belonged to the victims. The attacks were characterized by extreme violence that suggested rage or hatred that went far beyond what would be necessary simply to commit robbery or eliminate witnesses. On August 5th, Edward Schneider returned home to find his pregnant wife unconscious and bleeding from severe head wounds. Mrs. Schneider survived the attack and eventually recovered, though she had no memory of the assault and could provide no description of her attacker. The fact that she was pregnant seemed to have had no restraining effect on the killer, suggesting a level of callousness that horrified the community and added to the growing sense of panic in the city. The attacks continued through the summer and into the fall, creating an atmosphere of fear that permeated the Italian-American community in particular. Business owners began sleeping in their stores with weapons close at hand, and families installed additional locks and security measures in desperate attempts to protect themselves from an attacker who seemed capable of entering any building he chose. The investigation was hampered by the lack of witnesses and the absence of any clear motive for the attacks. The killer left no fingerprints or other forensic evidence that could be analyzed using the limited scientific techniques available at the time. His method of entry suggested someone with experience in carpentry or construction, but the population of New Orleans included thousands of men with such skills, making this clue of limited value in narrowing the field of suspects. Public pressure for results led to several arrests, but none of the suspects could be definitively linked to the crimes. The investigation was further complicated by ethnic tensions and prejudices that influenced both the police response and the community reaction to the attacks. Some officials suggested that the crimes might be the result of feuds within the Italian-American community, while others proposed that they were the work of a mentally disturbed individual with a particular hatred for Italian immigrants. Most bizarre aspect of the Axeman case emerged in March 1919, when a letter purportedly from the killer was published in the New Orleans Times-Picayune. The letter, written in a theatrical style that suggested either genuine insanity or a cruel sense of humor, claimed that the author was a supernatural being who could not be caught by mortal law enforcement. The letter writer claimed to be a resident of hottest hell who had been sent to New Orleans to collect souls, and he threatened to kill again on the night of March 19 unless the city's residents played jazz music in their homes and places of business. The letter concluded with the promise that anyone playing jazz would be spared, while those who remained silent would be at risk of attack. Whether the letter was genuine or the work of a hoaxer, its publication had a profound effect on the city. On the night of March 19th, New Orleans came alive with jazz music as residents followed the Axeman's bizarre instructions. Dance halls and restaurants were packed with people seeking safety in crowds and music, while private homes echoed with the sounds of phonographs and amateur musicians doing their part to appease whatever force was terrorizing their city. The night passed without any attacks, leading some to believe that the letter had indeed been written by the killer, and that he had kept his word to spare those who followed his instructions. Others argued that the absence of attacks was simply coincidental, and that the letter had been the work of someone seeking to exploit the city's fears for their own amusement. The attacks resumed in August 1919 with the murder of Steve Bocca, an Italian grocer who was found dead in his store with the familiar axe wounds that had become the Axeman's signature. The killing followed the established pattern, with evidence that the killer had entered through a modified door and had used the victim's own axe to commit the murder. Additional attacks in September and October suggested that the Axeman was becoming more bold and perhaps more unstable. The victims included both Italians and non-Italians, suggesting that ethnic targeting might not have been as significant a factor as initially believed. The killer's apparent ability to strike repeatedly without being caught or even clearly identified created a sense of helplessness among both the public and the police. The case took a dramatic turn on October 27, 1919, when Mike Pepitone was attacked and killed in his home while his wife and children slept in adjacent rooms. Mrs. Pepitone awakened to the sounds of the attack and saw a shadowy figure fleeing through the back door of the house, but she could provide no useful description of the killer. This would prove to be the Axeman's final attack, though no one knew it at the time. The investigation into the Pepitone murder led police to focus on several suspects, including individuals who had been seen in the neighborhood on the night of the attack. However, as with the previous cases, no definitive evidence could be found to support charges against any particular individual. The Axeman's attack ceased as suddenly as they had begun, leaving investigators and the public to wonder whether he had died, left the city, or simply chosen to end his campaign of terror. Various theories were proposed to explain his disappearance, including the possibility that he had been killed by vigilantes or had been arrested for some unrelated crime. In December 1920, more than a year after the final attack, a man named Joseph Mumford was shot and killed in Los Angeles by a woman later identified as the widow of Mike Pepitone. When arrested, she claimed that Mumford had been her husband's killer and that she had tracked him across the country to exact her own justice. Mumford had a criminal record that included several arrests for burglary and assault, and some investigators theorized that he might have been the ex-man. However, the evidence linking Mumford to the Axeman attacks was circumstantial at best, and many aspects of the case remained unexplained, even if he had been responsible for some of the crimes. The question of whether the attacks had been the work of a single individual or multiple criminals remained unresolved, as did the fundamental question of motive that had puzzled investigators from the beginning. Modern analysis of the Axeman case has suggested that the attacks might have been committed by more than one person, possibly criminals who adopted similar methods after the initial murders generated extensive newspaper coverage. The inconsistencies in some of the attacks, including variations in the killer's apparent skill level and methodology, support this theory. Other investigators have proposed that the Axeman might have been a serial killer whose crimes were motivated by psychological factors rather than robbery or ethnic hatred. This theory is supported by the excessive violence of the attacks and the killer's apparent enjoyment of the fear he created in the community. The case has become a part of New Orleans folklore, inspiring numerous books, articles, and even musical compositions that have attempted to capture the atmosphere of terror that gripped the city. During 1918 and 1919, the Axeman has become a part of the city's rich tradition of mysterious and supernatural stories, joining other local legends in the pantheon of New Orleans mysteries. As we consider this dark chapter from the Crescent City's history in the quiet of our evening reflection, we might contemplate how fear can transform even the most vibrant and culturally rich communities into places of suspicion and dread. New Orleans, that lived in terror of the Axeman, was a city where neighbors watched each other with mistrust, where the sounds of jazz that normally brought joy and celebration were used as desperate talismans against an unknown evil. The mystery of the Axeman's identity and motivation remains unsolved more than a century after his final attack, but his impact on New Orleans culture and folklore continues to resonate. The case reminds us that even in communities bound together by strong cultural traditions and mutual support, the actions of a single individual can create divisions and fears that persist long after the immediate danger has passed. The warm nights of New Orleans continue to carry the sound of jazz and the mingled sense of the city's diverse cultures, but they also carry the memory of a time when those same nights brought terror to families who had come to America seeking safety and opportunity, only to find themselves targets of an inexplicable and unstoppable violence. The mountain town of Keddie, California, nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills, was the kind of place where people came to escape the complexities of modern life. In 1981, the small resort community offered a slower pace, clean mountain air, and a sense of safety that comes from living in a place where everyone knows their neighbors. But on the morning of April 12, 1981, this peaceful mountain refuge became the scene of one of California's most brutal and puzzling unsolved crimes. The Keddie resort had seen better days by the time Sue Sharp and her 5 children moved into Cabin 28 in the autumn of 1980. What had once been a thriving vacation destination was now a collection of aging cabins that served as affordable housing for families seeking a fresh start away from the pressures of city life. Sue Sharp, recently divorced and struggling to make ends meet, had found in Keddie a place where she could raise her children in safety while working to rebuild her life. Sue was 36 years old, a woman whose gentle demeanor masked the inner strength that had carried her through the difficulties of single parenthood and financial hardship. Her children ranged in age from 5 to 15, each dealing in their own way with the disruptions that had marked their recent years. Johnny, the eldest at 15, had taken on responsibilities beyond his years, helping his mother care for his younger siblings and serving as the man of the house in ways that no teenager should have to experience. Sheila, 14, was Johnny's closest companion among the siblings, old enough to understand the family struggles, but still young enough to find joy in the simple pleasures of mountain life. The younger children, Greg, Rick, and little Tina, adapted to their new surroundings with the resilience that children often display, making friends among the other families at the resort and finding adventures in the forests and streams that surrounded their new home. The evening of April 11th, 1981, began like many others at Cabin 28. Sue had prepared dinner for her family, and the children had settled into their evening routines of homework, television, and the comfortable rhythms of domestic life. Johnny had a friend visiting, Donna Wingate, a 17-year-old from a nearby town who had become a regular presence at the Sharp household. Dana was well liked by the family, a polite and friendly young man who got along well with both Sue and her children. As the evening wore on, the children gradually made their way to bed. Sheila had made plans to spend the night at a friend's house, leaving the cabin to attend a sleepover that would prove to be a decision that saved her life. The younger boys, Greg and Rick, settled into their bedroom, while Johnny and Dana prepared to sleep in the living room area of the cabin. Sue Sharp retired to her bedroom, with 5-year-old Tina, the youngest of her children, who often slept with her mother for comfort and security. The cabin grew quiet as the family settled in for what they expected to be a peaceful night's rest, unaware that someone was already watching their home, planning an attack that would shatter the tranquility of the mountain community forever. Sometime during the dark hours of the early morning, one or more intruders entered Cabin 28 and began a savage assault that would claim the lives of 4 people and leave the surviving family members traumatized for life. The attack was characterized by a level of violence that shocked even experienced investigators, involving multiple weapons and indicating a degree of rage or hatred that went far beyond what would have been necessary to commit robbery or eliminate witnesses. Sue Sharp was found bound and gagged, having suffered multiple stab wounds and blunt force trauma that indicated a prolonged and brutal assault. Johnny Sharp and Donna Wingate were discovered in the living room, both having been killed by combinations of knife wounds and blows from blunt instruments. The scene suggested that the young men had attempted to defend themselves and possibly Sue Sharp, but had been overwhelmed by their attackers. Most mysteriously, 5-year-old Tina Sharp was missing from the scene entirely. Her absence created an additional layer of horror and urgency to the investigation, as detectives struggled to determine whether she had been kidnapped, had escaped during the attack, or had met a fate similar to the other victims in some location away from the cabin. The discovery of the bodies was made by Sheila Sharp when she returned from her sleepover on the morning of April 12th. The teenage girl's screams alerted neighbors, who quickly summoned law enforcement and emergency medical personnel. The scene that greeted the first responders was one of unimaginable horror, with evidence of extreme violence throughout the main living areas of the cabin. Remarkably, 12-year-old Greg Sharp and 10-year-old Rick Sharp were found unharmed in their bedroom, apparently having slept through the entire attack. The boys claimed to have heard nothing during the night, though investigators found it difficult to understand how such a violent assault could have occurred in the adjacent rooms without awakening them. Some experts suggested that the children might have been in such deep sleep that they were genuinely unaware of the attack, while others wondered if trauma might have affected their memories of the night's events. The investigation into the Keddy murders was complicated from the beginning by the remote location of the crime scene and the limited resources of the local law enforcement agency. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department was not equipped to handle a crime of this magnitude. and the initial response may have resulted in the loss or contamination of crucial evidence that might have helped identify the perpetrators. Asterisk, the crime. Scene itself presented numerous puzzles that would frustrate investigators for decades. The attackers had apparently entered the cabin through an unlocked door, suggesting either that they were familiar with the family's habits or that they had been watching the residence long enough to know when it would be most vulnerable. Use of multiple weapons, including knives and what appeared to be a hammer or similar tool, indicated either multiple attackers or a single individual who had come prepared for extreme violence. The binding and gagging of Sue Sharp suggested that the attack might have been motivated by something more than simple robbery or random violence. The level of rage indicated by the nature of the wounds inflicted on all the victims pointed to personal animosity or psychological factors that went beyond typical criminal motivations. However, the investigation failed to identify any enemies or personal conflicts that might have led to such extreme retaliation. The search for Tina Sharp became a major focus of the investigation, with hundreds of volunteers joining law enforcement personnel in combing the forests and streams surrounding Ketty. The possibility that the 5-year-old had escaped and was hiding somewhere in the wilderness gave hope to searchers, but also raised fears about her ability to survive in the mountain environment, especially during the cool April nights. Various theories emerged to explain the attack on the Sharp family. Some investigators focused on the possibility that the murders were drug-related, noting that the early 1980s had seen an increase in methamphetamine production and distribution in rural California communities. According to this theory, Sue Sharp, or one of the older children, might have become involved with drug dealers or witnessed criminal activity that led to their elimination. Asterisk, another theory suggested that the murders might have been committed by someone with a personal grudge against the Sharp family, possibly related to Sue's divorce or other personal relationships. The extreme violence of the attack seemed to indicate personal hatred rather than the dispassionate efficiency that might be expected from professional criminals or random attackers. The investigation also explored the possibility that the murders were committed by drifters or transients who had been camping in the area and had targeted the Sharp family for robbery. The Ketty area was known to attract various individuals seeking to live off the grid, and some of these people might have been involved in criminal activities or might have been suffering from mental health issues that could lead to violence. Local rumors and suspicions focused on several individuals who had been seen in the area around the time of the murders or who had exhibited suspicious behavior in the days following the discovery of the bodies. However, the investigation was hampered by the lack of physical evidence linking any specific suspects to the crime scene, and several promising leads ultimately proved to be dead ends. The case took a tragic turn 3 years later when Tina Sharp's remains were discovered in a remote area approximately 50 miles from Ketty. The location where her body was found suggested that she had been killed shortly after the attack on her family, and that her body had been transported to the remote location to conceal evidence of the crime. The discovery brought closure to the question of Tina's fate, but added new questions about the motivations and methods of her killers. The Ketty murders became one of California's most notorious unsolved cases, inspiring numerous books, documentaries, and amateur investigations that have attempted to identify the perpetrators and solve the mystery. The case has been featured in television programs and true crime publications, maintaining public interest and keeping pressure on law enforcement to continue their efforts to solve the crime. Over the years, various suspects have been identified and investigated, but none have been definitively linked to the murders through physical evidence or witness testimony. The passage of time has made the case increasingly difficult to solve. As witnesses have died or moved away, physical evidence has deteriorated, and memories have become less reliable. Recent advances in DNA analysis and other forensic techniques have led to renewed efforts to solve the Ketty murders. In 2016, The Plumas County Sheriff's Department announced that they had identified new persons of interest in the case and were pursuing fresh leads based on modern investigative techniques. However, as of the present time, no arrests have been made and the case remains officially unsolved. The impact of the Keddy murders extended far beyond the immediate victims and their family members. The crime shattered the sense of security that had characterized the mountain community and led many residents to reconsider their assumptions about safety in rural areas. The fact that such extreme violence could occur in a place like Keddy challenged the belief that small communities were inherently safer than urban areas. For the surviving members of the Sharp family, particularly Greg and Rick Sharp, the murders created trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The boys were placed in protective custody and eventually adopted by other family members, but the psychological impact of losing their mother, brother, and sisters in such a violent manner created challenges that extended well into their adult years. As we contemplate this tragic case from the California mountains, we might reflect on how violence can intrude into even the most peaceful and seemingly secure environments. The Sharp family had sought refuge in Keddy, hoping to find safety and a fresh start away from the complications of their previous life. Instead, they encountered a horror that no family should ever have to endure: the enduring mystery of who committed the Keddy murders and why continues to haunt not only the investigators who have worked on the case, but also the broader community that has been touched by this tragedy. The unanswered questions serve as a reminder that some crimes resist all attempts at solution, leaving behind only grief, speculation, and the hope that someday justice might finally be achieved for the victims and their surviving family members. Asterisk. The hope that someday justice might finally be achieved for the victims and their surviving family members. Ural Mountains of Russia stretch across the landscape like the backbone of a sleeping giant, their snow-covered peaks rising into the perpetual winter that grips this remote region for much of the year. In February 1959, these ancient mountains became the setting for one of the most baffling and tragic mysteries in the annals of outdoor recreation, an incident so inexplicable that it would inspire decades of investigation, speculation, and theory building. Among everyone from government officials to conspiracy theorists, the group that set out into the northern Urals was composed of experienced outdoor enthusiasts from the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, now known as Yekaterinburg. These were not novice hikers seeking a casual weekend adventure, but serious mountaineers and skiers who had planned an ambitious winter expedition that would test their skills against some of the most challenging terrain and weather conditions that the Russian wilderness could offer. Igor Dyatlov, the expedition leader, was 23 years old and already an accomplished outdoorsman with extensive experience in winter mountaineering. His leadership abilities and technical knowledge had earned him the respect of his fellow students, and he had been chosen to lead this expedition partly because of his demonstrated ability to make sound decisions under pressure and to ensure the safety of those under his care. The other members of the group were equally experienced and well prepared for the challenges they expected to face. They included Zenaida Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Krivonashenko, Yuri Doroshenko, Nicholas Thibaut Brignol, Alexander Kolevatov, Alexander Zolotaryov, and Ludmila Dubinina. Each had been selected for the expedition based on their skiing ability, their experience in winter conditions, and their proven ability to work effectively as part of a team in challenging circumstances that the planned route would take them through. Some of the most remote and demanding terrain in the northern Urals, including areas where winter temperatures could drop to dangerous levels and where sudden weather changes could create life-threatening conditions for even experienced outdoor enthusiasts. The expedition was planned to last approximately 2 weeks, with the group following a carefully planned route that would allow them to experience the challenge of winter mountaineering while maintaining reasonable safety margins. The group departed from Sverdlovsk on January 25, 1959, traveling by train and truck to reach the starting point of their expedition. They were well equipped with appropriate clothing, camping gear, and emergency supplies that should have been adequate for the conditions they expected to encounter. Their equipment included a tent designed for winter use, sleeping bags rated for extreme cold, and sufficient food and fuel to sustain them throughout their planned journey. The early stages of the expedition proceeded according to plan, with the group making good progress through the challenging terrain and maintaining their planned schedule. They were experienced in winter travel and knew how to manage the various risks associated with skiing and camping in sub-zero conditions. Their route took them through areas of stunning natural beauty, but also through terrain where a mistake or equipment failure could quickly become life-threatening. On January 28th, one member of the group, Yuri Yudin, became ill and was forced to turn back, leaving the remaining 9 members to continue with their planned expedition. Yudin's departure proved to be fortunate for him, as it would save his life, but it also meant that there would be no survivor to provide a first-hand account of what happened to the group during their final days. The last communication from the 5 group was on January 31st, when they were last seen alive by other people in the area. They were reported to be in good spirits and making satisfactory progress toward their planned destination. There was nothing in their behavior or circumstances that suggested any particular problems or concerns about their safety or their ability to complete the expedition successfully. When the group failed to return as scheduled, a search and rescue operation was launched. The delay in their expected return was initially not considered alarming, as weather conditions and other factors could easily cause delays in winter mountaineering expeditions. However, as days passed without any word from the group, concern grew and the search effort was expanded to include military personnel and aircraft. The searchers eventually located the group's campsite on the eastern slope of Kolatsiakal, a mountain whose name translates to Dead Mountain in the local Mansi language. The scene that greeted the rescue teams was both puzzling and disturbing, presenting a combination of evidence that seemed to defy rational explanation and would launch decades of investigation and speculation. Asterisk. The tent was found partially collapsed and cut open from the inside, as if the occupants had slashed their way out in desperate haste rather than using the normal entrance. This suggested that something had caused them to flee their shelter immediately, without taking time to gather proper clothing or equipment for survival in the extreme cold. The cuts in the tent fabric were clean and appeared to have been made deliberately with knives, indicating that this was not accidental damage. Most of the group's clothing and equipment remained inside the tent, including items that would have been essential for survival in the sub-zero temperatures that prevailed in the area. Shoes, coats, and other warm clothing were left behind, suggesting that whatever had prompted their flight from the tent had been so urgent that they had not taken time to dress appropriately for the conditions outside. The search for the missing hikers led to discovery of the first bodies approximately a mile from the campsite, near the tree line where the group had apparently attempted to build a fire. 2 of the hikers, Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko, were found with minimal clothing, having apparently died from hypothermia. The evidence suggested that they had attempted to climb a tree, possibly to observe something or to gather firewood for warmth. 3 more bodies, including that of Igor Dyatlov himself, were found between the tree line and the tent, positioned as if they had been attempting to return to their shelter. These hikers had also died from hypothermia, though they were slightly better clothed than the 2 found near the fire. The positioning of the bodies suggested a desperate attempt to return to the relative safety and warmth of their camp. The discovery of the remaining 4 bodies would not occur until months later, when the spring thaw revealed their location in a ravine some distance from the original campsite. These bodies presented even more disturbing evidence, as several showed signs of significant trauma that could not be easily explained by environmental factors or animal activity. Ludmila Dubanina was found with extensive chest injuries, including multiple fractured ribs and internal damage that would have been immediately fatal. Most disturbingly, her tongue and eyes were missing, though whether this was due to decomposition, animal scavenging, or some other factor remained unclear. Similar traumatic injuries were found on other members of this group, including skull fractures and other trauma that suggested exposure to tremendous force. The autopsy reports on these 4 bodies indicated that the injuries they had sustained were consistent with extreme blunt force trauma, comparable to what might be experienced in a high-speed automobile accident or a severe fall. However, the location where the bodies were found did not suggest any obvious mechanism for such injuries, and there was no evidence of an avalanche or other natural disaster that might have caused such trauma. Investigation into the Dyatlov Pass incident, as it came to be known, was conducted by Soviet authorities who were initially secretive about their findings and conclusions. The official cause of death was listed as a compelling natural force, a vague explanation that satisfied no one and only increased speculation about what had really happened to the 9 hikers. Various theories emerged to explain the mysterious deaths, ranging from natural disasters to military accidents to encounters with unknown phenomena. The avalanche theory was considered, but ultimately dismissed, as the slope where the tent was found was not steep enough to generate a significant avalanche, and there was no evidence of the kind of snow disturbance that would have been left by such an event. Military involvement was suspected by many, given the location of the incident, an area that was sometimes used for weapons testing. Some theorized that the hikers might have witnessed a military exercise or might have been accidentally exposed to some form of experimental weapon or technology. The traumatic injuries found on some of the bodies were cited as evidence supporting this theory, though no definitive proof was ever discovered. More exotic theories included encounters with extraterrestrial phenomena, attacks by unknown creatures, or exposure to some form of natural phenomenon that was not understood by conventional science. These theories were often dismissed by serious investigators, but continued to attract attention from those seeking explanations for the inexplicable aspects of the case. The secrecy surrounding the Soviet investigation only fueled additional speculation and conspiracy theories. The fact that the area around Dyatlov Pass was closed to hikers and researchers for several years after the incident suggested that authorities knew more about what had happened than they were willing to reveal publicly. In recent years, renewed interest in the case has led to additional investigations using modern forensic techniques and more open access to previously classified information. Some researchers have proposed new theories based on advanced understanding of weather phenomena, including the possibility that unusual wind conditions might have created infrasound that could cause panic and disorientation in humans. Other modern theories have focused on the possibility of a katabatic wind event, where extremely cold air flowing down from higher elevations could create dangerous conditions that might force people to flee their shelter. However, these theories still struggle to explain the severe traumatic injuries found on some of the victims or the specific pattern of evidence found at the scene. The case has also been examined in the context of indigenous beliefs and folklore related to the area where the incident occurred. The local Mansi people had traditional beliefs about spiritual forces in the mountains, and some researchers have wondered whether the hikers might have encountered something that was recognized by indigenous knowledge but not understood by modern science. Recent Russian government investigations have proposed that an avalanche, combined with other factors such as hypothermia and panic, might explain the incident. However, many experts and family members of the victims remain unsatisfied with these explanations, arguing that they do not adequately account for all the evidence found at the scene. The Dyatlov Pass incident has become one of Russia's most famous unsolved mysteries, inspiring numerous books, documentaries, and fictional treatments that have attempted to explain what happened to the 9 hikers. The case has attracted international attention and has become a subject of study for anyone interested in unexplained phenomena or unsolved mysteries. As we contemplate this tragic event from the remote mountains of Russia, we might reflect on how the wilderness can present challenges and dangers that go beyond our understanding or preparation. The 9 hikers who died at Dyatlov Pass were experienced and well-equipped, yet they encountered something that overwhelmed their skills and knowledge in a way that still defies explanation. More than 60 years later, the mystery serves as a reminder of how much about our natural world remains unknown or poorly understood, and how even in our modern age of scientific advancement, there are still phenomena that can confound our attempts at rational explanation. The questions raised by the Dyatlov Pass incident continue to intrigue investigators and amateur sleuths, representing one of those rare cases where the available evidence seems to point in multiple directions without providing a clear path to understanding. The small town of Villisca, Iowa, in 1912 embodied the quiet prosperity and moral certainty that characterized rural America in the early 20th century. With a population of just over 2,000 residents, it was the kind of place where children could play safely in tree-lined streets, where neighbors knew each other's business, and where the most serious crimes were typically limited to public drunkenness or minor theft. But on the morning of June 10, 1912, this peaceful community would awaken to discover that such innocence could be shattered in the most brutal and inexplicable way. The Moore family had lived in Villisca for several years, establishing themselves as respected members of the community through their involvement in local business and church activities. Josiah Moore, known to his friends as Joe, was a successful implement dealer who had built a thriving business selling farm equipment to the agricultural community that surrounded the town. His success had allowed him to purchase a comfortable 2-story house on South 2nd Street, where he lived with his wife Sarah and their 4 children. Sarah Moore was an active member of the Presbyterian Church and various women's organizations that formed the social fabric of small-town life. She was known for her kindness and hospitality, frequently opening her home to visitors and taking an active role in community activities. The Moore children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, were well regarded by their teachers and neighbors as polite, well-behaved youngsters who reflected the values that their parents had worked to instill in them. The evening of June 9, 1912, had been marked by a special event at the local Presbyterian church where the children had participated in a program that showcased their talents and provided entertainment for the congregation. Catherine Moore and her friend Lena Stillinger had performed together, and their presentation had been well received by the audience. After the program, the Stillinger girls, Lena and her younger sister Ina, had been invited to spend the night at the Moore house, a common occurrence that reflected the close relationships between families in the small community. The group had returned to the Moore house in high spirits, the children excited about their successful performance and looking forward to the sleepover that would extend their celebration. Sarah Moore had prepared treats for the children, and the evening had been spent in the kind of innocent fun that characterized childhood in rural America of that era. As the night progressed, the family and their guests had settled into their bedrooms, with the Stillinger girls sharing a bed in the downstairs guest room while the Moore family retired to their usual sleeping arrangements upstairs. The house grew quiet as its occupants drifted off to sleep, unaware that someone was already watching their home, planning an attack that would shock the nation and create one of America's most enduring unsolved mysteries. Sometime during the early morning hours of June 10th, an intruder entered the Moore house and systematically murdered all 8 occupants using an axe that was found at the scene. The attack was characterized by extreme brutality, with each victim suffering multiple blows that indicated a level of rage or hatred that went far beyond what would have been necessary simply to cause death. The discovery of the murders was made by Mary Peckham, a neighbor who became concerned when the Moore family failed to appear for their usual morning activities. When her knocks at the door went unanswered and she noticed that the house seemed unusually quiet, she contacted Josiah's brother, who had a key to the house. The scene that greeted them when they entered the house was one of unimaginable horror. All 8 victims had been killed while they slept, attacked with such ferocity that identification was initially difficult. The killer had used the blunt side of an axe, crushing skulls and inflicting wounds that suggested a frenzied attack that had continued long after the victims were dead. The crime scene revealed several disturbing details that would become central to the investigation and to the numerous theories that would emerge to explain the murders. The killer had apparently moved methodically through the house, killing each victim in their bed before moving on to the next room. The attacks had been conducted in near total silence, as neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual during the night. Most mysteriously, the killer had covered each victim's face with bedclothes or towels after the attack, suggesting either a sense of remorse or a ritualistic aspect to the crimes that went beyond simple murder. The covering of the faces implied that the killer had remained in the house after completing the murders, taking time to perform this additional action rather than fleeing immediately. The investigation also revealed that the killer had apparently spent considerable time in the house after the murders, moving through the rooms and possibly searching for something. Mirrors throughout the house had been covered with cloth, and there were signs that the killer had washed his hands and the murder weapon before leaving. These actions suggested someone who was either very calm under pressure or who had experience in covering up crimes. The weapon used in the attack was an axe that belonged to the Moore family, found in the guest room where the Stillinger girls had been killed. The fact that the killer had used the family's own axe suggested either that the murders were unpremeditated or that the attacker had been familiar enough with the house to know where tools were kept. The investigation into the Villisca murders quickly expanded to become one of the largest criminal investigations in Iowa's history. Detectives from across the Midwest were brought in to assist local law enforcement, and various theories were pursued in an attempt to identify the perpetrator and establish a motive for the horrific crime. One of the primary theories focused on Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher who had been in Villisca on the night of the murders and who had attended the church program where the Moore children had performed. Kelly's behavior following the murders was considered suspicious by some investigators, and his history of mental instability and previous encounters with law enforcement made him a person of interest in the case. Kelly was eventually arrested and tried twice for the murders, but both trials ended in hung juries as the evidence against him remained largely circumstantial. His alibis for the time of the murders were weak, and several witnesses testified about his strange behavior and comments that seemed to indicate knowledge of the crime. However, the prosecution was unable to present definitive proof of his guilt, and he was never convicted. Another suspect was Frank F. Jones, a prominent Villisca businessman who had previously employed Josiah Moore, but who had become involved in a bitter business dispute with him. Some investigators theorized that Jones might have hired someone to kill Moore and his family as revenge for perceived wrongs in their business relationship. This theory was supported by the fact that Jones seemed to have an alibi for the night of the murders, suggesting that if he was involved, he had arranged for someone else to carry out the attack. The investigation also considered the possibility that the murders were connected to other similar crimes that had occurred in the Midwest during the same period. Several other axe murders had been committed in Iowa, Illinois, Colorado, and Kansas between 1911 and 1912, and some investigators believed that these crimes might have been the work of a serial killer who traveled from town to town. The similarities between these cases included the use of an axe as the murder weapon, the targeting of entire families, and various ritualistic elements such as the covering of mirrors and the positioning of bodies. However, despite extensive investigation, no definitive connections could be established between the Villisca murders and the other similar crimes. the case attracted national attention, with newspapers across the country covering the investigation and speculating about the identity and motives of the killer. The brutal nature of the crime and the fact that it had occurred in a small, supposedly safe community captured the public imagination and challenged assumptions about where such violence could occur. Private detectives were hired by various parties, including family members and local officials who were dissatisfied with the progress of the official investigation. These private investigators pursued their own theories and suspects, sometimes working at cross purposes with law enforcement and occasionally creating additional confusion rather than clarity. The Veliska murders had a profound impact on the small community where they occurred. The sense of safety and security that had characterized life in the town was permanently shattered, and many residents installed new locks, moved away, or otherwise changed their behavior in response to the realization that such violence could occur in their midst. The Moore house itself became a source of fascination and fear for local residents. The building stood empty for many years after the murders, with various owners attempting to rent or sell it without success. Local folklore developed around the house, with stories of supernatural phenomena and ghostly apparitions that were said to haunt the scene of the crime. Over the years, numerous books, articles, and documentaries have examined the Veliska murders, each attempting to solve the mystery or present new evidence about the identity of the killer. Amateur investigators have continued to pursue leads and develop theories, keeping public interest in the case alive more than a century after the crime was committed. Modern forensic techniques have been applied to the case in recent years, with investigators hoping that advances in DNA analysis or other scientific methods might finally provide the breakthrough needed to solve the mystery. However, the passage of time and the degradation of physical evidence have limited the effectiveness of these efforts. The case has also been examined in the context of early 20th century American society, with scholars analyzing how the murders reflected broader social tensions and anxieties of the period. The fact that such violence could occur in a community that embodied traditional American values challenged assumptions about the relationship between rural life and safety that had been central to the national identity. As we reflect on this dark chapter from small-town America, we might consider how the Veliska murders represent more than just an unsolved crime, but a moment when the innocence and security of an entire way of life was called into question. The 8 victims who died that night were not just individuals, but representatives of the families and communities that formed the backbone of American society in the early 20th century. The mystery of who killed the Moore family and the Stillinger girls continues to intrigue investigators and amateur sleuths. But perhaps the larger question is what the case tells us about the nature of evil and the way that violence can intrude into even the most peaceful and secure environments. The quiet streets of Veliska in 1912 seemed to offer protection from the dangers and uncertainties of the modern world. But the murders demonstrated that such protection was ultimately an illusion. The enduring fascination with the case reflects our continued struggle to understand how and why such inexplicable violence occurs, and our desire to believe that mysteries can be solved and justice can be achieved, even when decades have passed without resolution. The questions raised by the Veliska murders remain as compelling today as they were when the first investigators walked through the blood-stained rooms of the Moore house more than a century ago. Asterisk. Los Angeles in January 1947 was a city caught between dreams and disillusionment, where the golden promise of Hollywood existed alongside darker realities that most preferred not to acknowledge. The palm trees swayed in the warm Pacific breeze. The orange groves still perfumed the suburban air, and the movie studios continued to manufacture fantasies for a world hungry for escape from the harsh realities of the post-war years. But beneath this glossy surface, the city harbored secrets and shadows that would occasionally surface in ways that shocked even those who thought they understood the true nature of America's entertainment capital. Elizabeth Short was 22 years old when she arrived in Los Angeles with the kind of dreams that had drawn countless young women to California since the early days of the film industry. Born in Massachusetts and raised in a family marked by economic hardship and personal tragedy, she had come west seeking the transformation that Hollywood promised to those beautiful and determined enough to seize it. She was striking in appearance, with dark hair, pale skin, and the kind of classic features that photographers found compelling. But she was also vulnerable in ways that made her ill-equipped for the brutal competition and casual cruelty that characterized the entertainment industry. Elizabeth had adopted the habit of dressing predominantly in black, a fashion choice that had earned her the nickname Black Dahlia among those who knew her in the bars, cafes, and cheap hotels where aspiring actors and actresses gathered to share their hopes and commiserate about their struggles. The nickname would later become tragically prophetic, transforming from a simple reference to her clothing preferences into one of the most famous monikers in the annals of American crime. Her life in Los Angeles was characterized by the kind of precarious existence that many young hopefuls experienced in this city of dreams. She moved frequently between temporary accommodations, stayed with various acquaintances, and supported herself through a combination of part-time work and the generosity of men who were attracted to her beauty and her apparent vulnerability. It was a lifestyle that brought her into contact with a wide range of people, from legitimate businessmen to individuals whose activities operated in the gray areas between legal and illegal enterprise. Elizabeth's personal relationships were complex and often troubled, marked by her apparent search for security and genuine affection in a city where both were rare commodities. She had been engaged to a military officer who had been killed in the war, a loss that had contributed to her decision to seek a new life in California. Her subsequent relationships with various men in Los Angeles were often brief and sometimes problematic, reflecting both her own emotional vulnerabilities and the challenges faced by young women trying to establish themselves in a competitive and often exploitative environment. On January 9, 1947, Elizabeth was last seen alive at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, where she had been staying and where she was spotted in the lobby by several witnesses. She appeared to be waiting for someone, though the identity of this person and the nature of their planned meeting would never be definitively established. After leaving the hotel, she seemed to vanish into the sprawling metropolis of Los Angeles, beginning a period of 6 days during which her whereabouts and activities remained completely unknown. The discovery of Elizabeth Short's body on the morning of January 15, 1947, would transform her from an anonymous aspiring actress into one of the most famous murder victims in American history. The location where she was found, a vacant lot in the Leimert Park neighborhood, was not far from the more affluent areas of Los Angeles, but it was isolated enough that her body might have remained undiscovered for some time, if not for the chance observation of a mother walking with her young daughter. Betty Bersinger was taking a morning stroll with her 3-year-old daughter when she noticed what she initially thought might be a discarded mannequin lying in the weedy lot. As she approached for a closer look, the horrifying reality of what she was seeing became apparent, and she immediately contacted the police, setting in motion what would become one of the most intensive and widely publicized criminal investigations in Los Angeles history. The condition of Elizabeth Short's body was so shocking that even experienced homicide detectives were disturbed by what they encountered at the scene. She had been killed elsewhere, and her body had been carefully posed in the vacant lot, positioned in a way that suggested the killer had spent considerable time arranging the scene for maximum impact. The body had been severed at the waist with surgical precision, and there were numerous other injuries that indicated prolonged torture and mutilation. The methodical nature of the killer's work suggested someone with anatomical knowledge or surgical experience, leading investigators to focus their attention on individuals with medical training. The precision of the cuts and the apparent care with which the body had been drained of blood indicated a level of expertise that went beyond what would be expected from a typical criminal. This led to theories that the killer might have been a doctor, a medical student, or someone else with professional knowledge of human anatomy. The investigation into Elizabeth Short's murder became a massive undertaking that involved hundreds of detectives and generated thousands of pages of reports and evidence. The Los Angeles Police Department devoted enormous resources to the case, partly because of the shocking nature of the crime, and partly because of the intense public and media attention that it generated. The case became a sensation in the press, with newspapers competing to provide the most sensational coverage and offering rewards for information leading to the killer's capture. The media coverage of the Black Dahlia case was unprecedented for its time, with reporters pursuing every possible angle and publishing details about Elizabeth's life that would later be criticized as invasive and exploitative. The press coverage contributed to the development of numerous myths and misconceptions about both Elizabeth and her killer, some of which continue to influence public perception of the case decades later. The investigation pursued numerous leads and suspects, ranging from individuals who had known Elizabeth personally to strangers who had been in the area around the time of her disappearance. The police received thousands of tips from the public, many of which proved to be false leads, generated by the intense media coverage of the case. Several individuals confessed to the murder, but these confessions were determined to be the products of mental illness or attention-seeking rather than genuine admissions of guilt. One of the most significant aspects of the investigation was the analysis of letters and packages that were sent to newspapers and police departments, allegedly from the killer. These communications included items that appeared to have belonged to Elizabeth, including her social security card and birth certificate. The letters were written in a distinctive style and contained information that seemed to indicate inside knowledge of the crime, but handwriting analysis and other forensic techniques available at the time were unable to definitively authenticate them or lead to the identification of their author. The investigation also revealed disturbing details about Elizabeth's final days and the circumstances that had led to her death. Evidence suggested that she had been held captive for several days before being killed, during which time she had been subjected to prolonged torture and abuse. The killer appeared to have taken considerable time with his victim, suggesting either extreme sadism or some form of ritualistic motivation that went beyond simple murder. Various theories emerged about the identity and motivation of Elizabeth Short's killer. Some investigators focused on the possibility that she had been killed by someone involved in organized crime, perhaps because she had witnessed something that made her a liability, or because she had become involved with dangerous people through her lifestyle in Los Angeles. This theory was supported by the professional nature of the killing and the apparent expertise displayed in the handling and positioning of the body. Other theories suggested that the killer might have been someone from Elizabeth's personal life, possibly an individual who had become obsessed with her and had ultimately been driven to violence by rejection or jealousy. The intimate knowledge of her personal effects and the apparent planning that went into the crime supported the idea that the killer had known Elizabeth personally and had been planning the attack for some time. More exotic theories proposed that the murder might have been connected to Hollywood personalities or might have involved individuals with connections to the entertainment industry. Some investigators wondered if Elizabeth might have been killed because of information she possessed about powerful people, or if she might have been the victim of some form of blackmail scheme that had gone wrong. The case also attracted attention from amateur investigators and crime enthusiasts who developed their own theories about the identity of the Black Dahlia killer. Over the years, numerous books and articles have been published proposing solutions to the case, often focusing on specific individuals who the authors believe were responsible for Elizabeth's death. However, none of these proposed solutions have been accepted by law enforcement, or have provided sufficient evidence to definitively solve the case. The Black Dahlia murder has become one of America's most famous unsolved crimes, inspiring countless books, movies, and television programs that have explored various aspects of the case. The enduring fascination with Elizabeth Short's murder reflects both the shocking nature of the crime and the way it seemed to embody the dark side of the American dream and the dangers that could await those who sought fame and fortune in Hollywood. Modern forensic techniques have been applied to the case in recent years, with investigators hoping that advances in DNA analysis or other scientific methods might finally provide the breakthrough needed to identify Elizabeth Short's killer. However, the passage of time and the deterioration of physical evidence have limited the effectiveness of these efforts, and the case remains officially unsolved. The investigation into the Black Dahlia murder also highlighted broader issues about the treatment of women in 1940s America and the vulnerability of young women who found themselves alone in large cities without adequate support systems. Elizabeth Short's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers that could befall those who pursued their dreams without sufficient preparation or protection. The impact of the case extended beyond the immediate investigation to influence how similar crimes were investigated and reported in subsequent years. The intensive media coverage and the public fascination with the details of the case established patterns that would be repeated in other high-profile criminal investigations, contributing to the development of what would later be recognized as true crime as a distinct form of popular entertainment. As we reflect on this tragic case from post-war Los Angeles, we might consider how Elizabeth Short's story represents more than just an unsolved murder, but a window into the social and cultural dynamics of an era when America was struggling to redefine itself after the end of World War II. The young woman who became known as the Black Dahlia was seeking transformation and opportunity in a city that promised both but delivered neither, instead becoming the victim of violence that reflected the darker aspects of human nature that existed alongside the glamour and optimism of Hollywood's golden age. The mystery of who killed Elizabeth Short and why continues to intrigue investigators and amateur sleuths more than 75 years after her death. The case remains a reminder of how violence can intrude into individual lives and transform them into symbols of broader cultural anxieties and fears. The questions raised by the Black Dahlia murder continue to resonate, not only because they remain unanswered, but because they touch on fundamental issues about safety, vulnerability, and the price that some individuals pay for pursuing their dreams in an unforgiving world. The vacant lot where Elizabeth Short's body was discovered has long since been developed, and the Biltmore Hotel where she was last seen alive continues to serve guests who may be unaware of its connection to one of America's most famous unsolved murders. But the memory of the Black Dahlia endures, a reminder that some mysteries transcend their specific time and place to become part of the broader human story about the search for justice and the enduring power of the unknown to capture our imagination and hold it fast. And so our journey through these enduring mysteries draws toward a close for tonight. Each case we've explored serving as a chapter in the larger story of human nature and the eternal dance between the known and the unknowable. From the gaslit streets of Edwardian New York to the sun-soaked boulevards of post-war Los Angeles, from the quiet farmsteads of rural America to the remote wilderness of the Russian mountains, we've traveled together through landscapes both geographical and psychological, visiting places where ordinary lives intersected with extraordinary mysteries. These stories remind us that mystery and wonder continue to exist in our modern world, waiting patiently in the shadows of history for those curious enough to seek them out and thoughtful enough to appreciate their enduring power to captivate the human imagination. Whether the truth lies buried in forgotten archives, hidden in the memories of those who can no longer speak, or simply beyond the reach of human understanding, these mysteries persist as testament to the complexity of existence and the limits of our knowledge. As you settle deeper into rest. May these tales serve not as sources of unease, but as gentle companions that remind us that questions can be as valuable as answers, that wonder can coexist with knowledge, and that some of the most compelling stories are those that trust us to find meaning in the mystery itself rather than demanding resolution. Rest well, wherever you may be listening, and may your dreams carry you safely through the quiet hours until morning brings its own mysteries and possibilities. Until we meet again in the realm of the unknown, sleep peacefully, knowing that curiosity and wonder await your return. This is the story of Cedar Point Light and of Thomas Whitmore, the lighthouse keeper whose dedication to his duty was matched only by the enigma that surrounded his final years. It's a tale of isolation and obsession, of duty and mystery, set against the eternal rhythm of waves and the turning of seasons on a windswept island where time seemed to move differently than it did on the mainland. The call came to the Coast Guard station in Rockport, Maine, on November 15, 1983, just as the first snow of winter was beginning to dust the granite shores of Penobscot Bay. Captain William Hayes, a 30-year veteran of the Coast Guard, took the report himself. A commercial fishing vessel had passed Cedar Point Light the night before and noticed that the beacon wasn't operating on its regular schedule. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. Lighthouse equipment, even with modern improvements, occasionally malfunctioned, and lighthouse keepers were expected to handle routine repairs. But when the same fishing vessel passed the island again 12 hours later and found the light still dark, the captain had decided to report it. Captain Hayes dispatched a patrol boat to Cedar Point Island that afternoon, cutting through choppy seas under a gray November sky. The island sat 3 miles off the Maine coast, a 40-acre piece of granite and pine trees that had been home to a lighthouse since 1847. In 1983, it was one of the last manned lighthouses on the New England coast, most others having been automated or decommissioned. Thomas Whitmore had been the keeper of Cedar Point Light for 11 years, ever since his retirement from the Merchant Marine in 1972. At 68, he was known as a reliable and dedicated keeper, someone who took pride in maintaining the light and the small station that had been his home for more than a decade. When the Coast Guard patrol boat reached Cedar Point Island that November afternoon, they found the lighthouse dark and silent, its beacon extinguished for the first time in over a century. More puzzling still, they found no sign of Thomas Whitmore anywhere on the island. What they did find would launch an investigation that lasted 6 months, involved multiple agencies, and generated more questions than answers. The mystery of Thomas Whitmore and Cedar Point Light would become one of Maine's most enduring unsolved cases, a story that combined elements of the impossible with the heartbreakingly human. Cedar Point Island rises from the North Atlantic like a piece of ancient granite sculpture, its cliffs worn smooth by centuries of storms and tides. The highest point of the island reaches 90 feet above sea level, crowned by the white tower of Cedar Point Light, a structure that has guided mariners safely through the treacherous waters of Penobscot Bay since before the Civil War. The lighthouse itself is a classic New England design, a cylindrical tower of white-painted brick, 58 feet tall, with a red lantern room at the top housing a third-order Fresnel lens installed in 1902. Adjacent to the tower stands the keeper's house, a modest 2-story structure of weathered shingle and stone that had been Thomas Whitmore's home since his appointment in 1972. The island's natural beauty was stark and uncompromising. Pine trees clung to pockets of soil in the granite, their branches shaped by constant wind into sculptural forms that seemed to reach inland, away from the sea's relentless presence. Tide pools dotted the shoreline, filled with sea anemones and periwinkles that had adapted to the rhythm of Maine's dramatic tides. In spring and summer, the island bloomed with wild roses and lupins, But by November, it had settled into its winter palette of gray stone, dark evergreens, and white-capped waves. Thomas Whitmore had come to Cedar Point Island carrying 43 years of experience at sea. Born in Bar Harbor in 1915, he had joined the merchant marine as a young man and spent most of his adult life aboard cargo ships and tankers, traveling routes that took him around the world. He had served briefly in the Navy during World War II, manning supply ships in the Pacific Theater, and had returned to merchant service afterward. Those who knew him described Thomas as a quiet, methodical man with a deep respect for the sea, and an almost mystical understanding of weather patterns and maritime conditions. He could predict storms hours before they appeared on weather reports, and he had an uncanny ability to sense when ships were in distress, often lighting the Cedar Point beacon early to guide vessels that hadn't yet realized they were in danger. Lighthouse keeper's job in 1983 was both simpler and more complex than it had been in earlier decades. Modern navigation equipment meant that ships relied less on visual landmarks, but the Cedar Point Light remained an important backup system and a required navigation aid for the fishing fleet that worked the waters of Penobscot Bay. Thomas's daily routine had been consistent for 11 years. He rose before dawn to check the weather conditions and radio the Coast Guard with his morning report. He spent his days maintaining the lighthouse equipment, tending a small garden on the island's sheltered southern slope, and keeping detailed logs of ship traffic, weather patterns, and the condition of the light itself. Evenings were devoted to reading. Thomas maintained an extensive library in the keeper's house, and to his correspondence. He wrote letters regularly to a small circle of friends from his merchant marine days, many of whom had also settled into retirement in coastal Maine towns. He kept a detailed personal journal, recording not just the practical aspects of lighthouse keeping, but his observations about island life, the changing seasons, and the endless variations of sea and sky that surrounded him. Supplies were delivered to the island twice monthly by a Coast Guard vessel, bringing food, mail, fuel for the generator, and any equipment needed for lighthouse maintenance. Thomas occasionally returned to the mainland for medical appointments or to handle personal business, but these trips were infrequent. He seemed genuinely content with his isolated life, telling visitors that the island provided everything he needed for peace and purpose. The keeper's house itself reflected Thomas's personality, neat, practical, and comfortable without being luxurious. The first floor contained a kitchen, sitting room, and office where Thomas maintained his logs and correspondence. The second floor had a bedroom and a small library that Thomas had gradually expanded over his years on the island. Books filled shelves that lined 3 walls, covering subjects from maritime history to astronomy, literature to meteorology. One room in the house had always puzzled visitors: the second bedroom, which could have served as guest quarters or additional storage, remained almost empty except for a single chair positioned by the window that faced northeast toward the mainland. Thomas called it his observation room, and he spent time there most evenings, sitting quietly and watching the distant lights of the coastal towns. The lighthouse mechanism itself was Thomas's pride and joy. The third-order Fresnel lens, manufactured in Paris and installed in 1902, created a beam that could be seen for 18 nautical miles on a clear night. Thomas maintained the lens with careful attention, cleaning each prism weekly and calibrating the rotation mechanism that caused the light to flash in its distinctive pattern: 2 seconds on, 4 seconds off, repeated continuously from sunset to sunrise. By November of 1983, Thomas Whitmore had become as much a part of Cedar Point Island as the lighthouse itself. Fishermen who worked the waters around the island would wave when they passed close enough to see him, and he would respond with a blast from the lighthouse fog signal. Children in the coastal towns drew pictures of the lighthouse man in school, and tourists who glimpsed the island from excursion boats would wonder about the solitary figure who kept the light burning. What none of them knew was that Thomas Whitmore was harboring a secret that had been growing more complex and consuming with each passing month. Asterisk. The first indication that something unusual was happening on Cedar Point Island came in the summer of 1983, though its significance wouldn't become clear until after Thomas Whitmore's disappearance. Captain Joseph Murphy, who ran supply runs to the lighthouse, noticed that Thomas had begun requesting additional fuel for the generator, much more than would be needed for normal lighthouse operations. When Captain Murphy asked about the increased fuel consumption, Thomas explained that he was running the generator longer hours to power additional equipment. He didn't elaborate on what this equipment might be, and Captain Murphy, respecting the keeper's privacy, didn't press for details. Around the same time, Thomas began receiving packages that were delivered with his regular mail. These packages, shipped from various electronic suppliers and technical equipment companies, were smaller than the usual lighthouse maintenance supplies, but arrived with increasing frequency throughout the summer and early fall. Mrs. Dorothy Carlson, the postal clerk in Rockport who processed Thomas's mail, remembered the packages because of their return addresses companies that specialized in radio equipment, optical instruments, and precision measuring devices. This seemed unusual for a lighthouse keeper whose equipment needs were generally met through Coast Guard supply channels. Thomas's behavior during his occasional trips to the mainland also began to change. Previously, his visits had been brief and focused on specific errands, medical appointments, banking, purchasing personal supplies. But during the summer of 1983, he began making longer trips that included visits to the Rockport Library, where he spent hours researching topics that seemed unrelated to lighthouse keeping. Mrs. Helen Morrison, the head librarian, recalled that Thomas had become particularly interested in historical records relating to shipping in Penobscot Bay during the 19th century. He spent considerable time reviewing old ship logs, newspaper archives, and maritime records, taking careful notes in a small notebook that he always carried with him. He was looking for something specific, Mrs. Morrison told investigators later. Not just casual research, but focused investigation. He asked very detailed questions about shipping routes, weather patterns, and particularly about ships that had been lost or had gone missing in these waters. Thomas also began corresponding with maritime historians and nautical archaeologists, exchanges that generated a steady stream of letters and documents delivered to the island. His longtime friend, Captain Edward Ross, who had served with Thomas in the Merchant Marine and maintained regular correspondence with him, noticed that Thomas's letters had become more cryptic and philosophical. Tom had always been a thoughtful man, Captain Ross explained during his interview with investigators. But his letters that summer were different. He wrote about patterns in the sea and messages that most people don't know how to read. He seemed to be working on some kind of project, but he never explained what it was. The most significant change in Thomas's routine involved his evening activities. For 11 years, Thomas had followed a consistent schedule, lighting the beacon at sunset, checking the mechanism at regular intervals throughout the night, and extinguishing the light at sunrise. But beginning in August 1983, Coast Guard personnel and local fishermen began noticing irregularities in the lighthouse's operation. Sometimes, the light would flash in patterns that didn't match its standard sequence. Other times it would remain lit during daylight hours, when it should have been extinguished. On several occasions, the light was observed flashing in what appeared to be deliberate patterns, not random malfunctions, but purposeful variations in the timing and duration of the flashes. When Coast Guard officials questioned Thomas about these irregularities during his September supply delivery, he apologized and attributed them to calibration issues with the timing mechanism. He assured them that he was working to resolve the problems and that the light would return to its standard operation. But the irregularities continued, and by October, they had become more pronounced. The lighthouse beam was observed operating in sequences that fishermen described as like Morse code, but longer and more complex. Some observers claim to have counted patterns that repeated over periods of several hours, suggesting that whatever was causing the variations was intentional and systematic. Thomas's personal behavior during this period became increasingly secretive. He began declining social visits from Coast Guard personnel, claiming that he was busy with maintenance projects that required his full attention. His responses to radio communications became brief and formal, lacking the friendly conversation that had previously characterized his interactions with shore personnel. The packages he was receiving became more frequent and more varied. In addition to electronic equipment, he began receiving books on subjects ranging from advanced mathematics to marine biology, astronomy to meteorology. Mrs. Carlson noted that many of the books appeared to be technical manuals or academic text, snot, the kind of reading material one would expect a retired lighthouse keeper to order. Perhaps most significantly, Thomas began staying awake for much longer periods. Previous supply deliveries had found him maintaining normal daytime hours, but by October, Coast Guard personnel noticed that Thomas appeared fatigued during their visits, as if he had been sleeping very little. When asked about his health, Thomas insisted he was fine, but admitted that he had been working on something important that required his attention during nighttime hours. Local fishermen who worked the waters around Cedar Point Island began reporting unusual observations of their own. Several claimed to have seen lights on the island at times when the lighthouse beacon was extinguished. Not the bright beam of the lighthouse itself, but smaller lights that seemed to move around the island's shoreline or appear in the windows of the keeper's house at odd hours. One fisherman, Captain Robert Sterling, reported an particularly puzzling incident from early November. While checking his lobster traps near Cedar Point Island around 3 a.m., he observed the lighthouse beacon operating in what he described as an incredibly complex pattern flashes of different durations and intensities that continued for over an hour. It wasn't random, Captain Sterling told investigators. It was like watching someone send a very long, very complicated message. The timing was too precise to be accidental, and it repeated certain sequences if it was important that someone understand exactly what was being communicated. Captain Sterling also noted that during this incident, he had observed additional lights in the keeper's house, not just the normal room lights, but what appeared to be focused beams, as if Thomas was using searchlights or powerful flashlights for some purpose. The final unusual incident before Thomas's disappearance occurred on November 10th, just 5 days before the Coast Guard discovered the lighthouse dark and the keeper missing. A Coast Guard helicopter conducting a routine patrol of the area reported seeing unusual activity on Cedar Point Island during a nighttime flight. The pilot, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Walsh, described observing what appeared to be signal lights being operated from various points around the island, not just from the lighthouse tower, but from the shoreline, the keeper's house, and even from what seemed to be a boat anchored near the island's eastern shore. It looked like some kind of coordinated signaling operation, Lieutenant Commander Walsh reported. Multiple light sources operating in patterns that seemed related to each other, as if they were all part of the same communication system. When the helicopter circled back for a second observation, all the unusual lights had been extinguished, and only the regular lighthouse beacon remained visible, operating on its standard schedule. Lieutenant Commander Walsh's report was filed with the Coast Guard station, but because Thomas had always been considered a reliable keeper, and because there was no indication of distress or emergency, no immediate action was taken. In retrospect, investigators would recognize this incident as the last confirmed sighting of Thomas Whitmore in action as keeper of Cedar Point Light, **.